Settle in. Get comfortable wherever you are right now. Pull something warm around you if you have it nearby. Turn the screen brightness down a little. This one is going to take a long time, and that is entirely by design, because the subject deserves it, and because the point tonight is not to get through things quickly, but to sit with them long enough for the details to come into focus. Tonight we are going season by season through Family Guy. Not to recap plots you already know, not to rank episodes, not to argue about quality across the show's long run. We are going somewhere quieter than any of that. We are going to sit down with the parts of the show that the writers tucked into corners and never fully came back for. The dropped threads. The planted questions that accumulated without being answered. The characters who were given entire interior lives through suggestion and implication, and then left to carry those lives without the story ever slowing down long enough to ask what the weight of them actually felt like. Every season of Family Guy has at least one genuine mystery buried somewhere inside it. Some are small and personal, the kind of thing that only becomes visible when you slow down enough to look at the shape of what the show was building underneath the jokes. Some are large and structural, questions about the nature of the world the show takes place in, and whether the events of that world can be trusted to be real. And some exist in the uncomfortable space between comedy and something more honest. In that particular territory where the show was clearly trying to make you laugh and accidentally said something true. The town of Quahog, Rhode Island is fictional, but it has a weight to it that most fictional places do not manage. It has been inhabited, across more than 20 seasons and more than 400 episodes, by a specific collection of people each carrying something. A history, a secret, a failure, an unanswered question about who they actually are. The show spent its entire run gesturing at these things without ever quite sitting down with any of them long enough to name them plainly. So, we are going to do that tonight. One season at a time. One mystery per stop, in no rush at all. Find a comfortable position. Let the words come at whatever pace they come. We are going to walk through this world together, and it is going to take a while, and that is exactly fine. Section 1. Season 1. The Strange Life and Convenient Death of Jonathan Weed. The first episode of Family Guy aired on January 31st, 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33. It pulled in somewhere around 22 million viewers, which is a staggering number for any debut. Inflated somewhat by the guaranteed Super Bowl audience, but still representing genuine public engagement with whatever Fox had placed in that prime slot. The show arrived in American living rooms with maximum visibility and used it to introduce Peter Griffin, overweight, not especially bright, working class, living in a fictional suburb of Providence, Rhode Island, along with his wife Lois, their 3 children, and a talking dog named Brian who had apparently been drinking since before the episode started. At the center of Peter's professional life, from that first episode all the way through the end of Season 3, sat a man named Jonathan Weed. Mr. Weed owned and operated the happy-go-lucky toy factory where Peter worked. He was the anchor of Peter's economic existence, the person with the authority to determine on any given day whether the basic structure of Peter's life held together or came apart. The relationship between them operated as a reliable loop. Peter created chaos of some form. Mr. Weed fired him. Something shifted in the situation. Peter was rehired. It was the kind of stable, repeating rhythm that early television uses to establish a settled world. A world where consequences arrive but do not accumulate, where everything returns to its starting position before the next episode begins. But Mr. Weed, when you look at him carefully across his full run of appearances, turns out to be considerably more interesting than his functional role requires him to be. The show built him with a level of specificity that exceeded what the comedy alone demanded. Details accumulated around him across multiple episodes, small details, placed with clear awareness of each other, building over time a portrait of a person with an interior life that the show kept approaching from different angles without ever fully stepping inside. The first episode, Death Has a Shadow, was written by Seth MacFarlane and establishes the basic shape of their professional relationship. Peter arrives at the factory, still drunk from the night before. He falls asleep on the job during a safety inspection, and the factory ships toys packed with razor blades, a porcupine, a toaster with forks already inserted, a gasoline can, and exposed electrical components. The resulting press coverage is immediate and catastrophic. Mr. Weed fires Peter on the spot, which is a reasonable response to what just occurred. By the episode's end, Peter returns a signed baseball that Brian stole during his brief period of factory employment, and Mr. Weed, moved by this gesture, or at least willing to treat it as sufficient grounds for a second chance, rehires him. The loop is established. The telling details begin accumulating with the 5th episode of the season, A Hero Sits Next Door, when Peter mentions in passing that he walked into the locker room at the factory and found a man named Guillermo, a ringer Mr. Weed had brought in for the company's softball team, apparently bench-pressing Mr. Weed. The line lands quickly. The show does not linger, but the image is specific: a locker room, which is a private space, a man named Guillermo, and that particular physical arrangement between them. In the same episode, Mr. Weed watches the newly introduced Joe Swanson across a gathering and describes him with a particular quality of emphasis as attractive. The word carries unmistakable intention. Later in the season, in The King is Dead, Peter invents a toy called Mr. Zucchini Head. The shape of the toy is not subtle, and the episode does not try to make it subtle. It is presented at the factory. Mr. Weed takes it into his private office. The door closes. The scene ends on the closed door, and we never see what happens next inside that room. In the very first episode, when Peter breaks the relevant anatomy from a statue of David and it sails through Mr. Weed's office window, Mr. Weed retrieves what has landed on his desk, names it Eduardo, and keeps it. He says the name with the warmth of someone naming something they intend to keep permanently. None of these moments are accidents in the writing. Each one is placed deliberately, with awareness of the others, building across multiple episodes a picture of a man whose private life looks quite different from the face he presents to the factory floor. A man who has learned, at considerable cost across the years of his life, to maintain a strict separation between the self that operates publicly and the self that exists in rooms where the door is closed. This was not unusual for someone of his approximate generation and approximate professional standing. It was, in many places and many contexts, the price of a functioning career. His full name deepens the picture considerably. His actual name, revealed in a casual aside early in the series, is Jonathan Bermuda Grass. Weed is not a family name in the traditional inherited sense. It was assigned to his grandfather at an immigration checkpoint, given by someone at the desk who either did not speak the language that produced the original surname or did not have the patience to render it accurately in the available time. The grandfather became Weed. The name passed to his descendants. Jonathan grew up as Jonathan Weed, built a factory under that name, ran employees under it, moved through the professional world carrying an identity that had arrived via administrative convenience rather than via any authentic connection to his actual history. There is something in this detail, the name that came from a checkpoint rather than from a lineage, the public identity that was given rather than grown, that resonates with everything else the show built around this character. He carries an assigned surface and a private reality simultaneously. He is Jonathan Weed, the factory owner, where other people can see him, and whoever he actually is in the kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the companion who films breakfast videos is standing with the camera. The death arrives in the season 3 episode Mr. Saturday Night. Peter has arranged a dinner at the Griffin household specifically designed to engineer the conditions for Mr. Weed to offer him a promotion. The evening goes better than expected. Mr. Weed is charmed by the family, delighted by Brian's conversational ability, moved by the warmth of the household even in its considerable chaos, and he is partway through a sentence about Peter's future at the company when Brian begins choking on a dinner roll. Peter and Lois apply the Heimlich maneuver with more force than precision. The roll launches from Brian's throat on a neat arc across the table and lodges itself fatally in Mr. Weed's. He chokes. He did. At the Griffin dinner table in the middle of someone else's sentence about someone else's future. The Grim Reaper arrives in this episode voiced by Norm Macdonald, dry, unhurried, possessing the specific energy of someone who has done this particular job so many times that the novelty departed long ago. He announces that the police are conducting a random dead body search, which sends Peter into full panic mode and toward the nearest toilet. Death admits he was joking. The immediate aftermath is handled with the show's characteristic refusal to allow anything to remain solemn for very long. Then the will is presented. At Mr. Weed's funeral, his attorney presents the will via videotape. The tape begins playing. It is immediately obvious this is not the will tape. The assembled mourners and employees watch Mr. Weed making breakfast in his underwear on an ordinary morning, filmed by a male companion who is clearly comfortable in the space. This is not a first visit, not a special occasion, not a carefully arranged scene, but a regular Tuesday morning, captured by someone who has regular access to those mornings. The attorney fast-forwards past it with visible embarrassment. The actual will begins. Mr. Weed announces that the happy-go-lucky toy factory, upon his death, is to be demolished. Not sold to a competitor, not transferred to a business partner or an heir who might continue operating it. Demolished. Physically removed from the landscape. And in its place, a new institution is to be constructed, the Happy-Go-Lucky Terminal Disease Institute. The building comes down that afternoon. Everyone is out of work. The structure that anchored the professional dimension of Peter's life for 3 full seasons vanishes from the map of the show's world in the time it takes a demolition crew to execute an order. The writer's practical reason for this story choice is clear enough from the outside. They wanted to transition Peter to a new job, specifically the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery position he would occupy for the next several seasons, and needed a clean ending to the old chapter. Killing Mr. Weed and demolishing the factory was efficient. The factory era closed decisively. The new era could begin without residue. But look at what Mr. Weed actually chose to do with his death. He spent decades building a business. He made it the primary structure of his professional identity, the thing he was known as in the community, the framework around which his working days were organized. He was Jonathan Weed, the factory owner. That was who he was in the world where other people could see him. And he arranged specifically for that identity, that building, that legacy, to be wiped from existence at the moment by moment of his departure. No continuation, no monument, no name on a door somewhere. Just demolition, replaced by a place for people who are dying. A Terminal Disease Institute is organized entirely around the experience of ending. It is not a hospital, which is organized around recovery and the preservation of futures. A Terminal Disease Institute looks at mortality without turning away and tries to make the passage from life something other than purely terrible and purely alone. It provides care and presence at the specific threshold where most of the world has already looked somewhere else. It is, as an institution, an act of sustained, unflinching honesty about what the final stages of human experience actually require from the people who are willing to meet them. The comedy answer for why Mr. Weed chose this, the surprise is the joke. The gap between what you assumed would be left behind and what was actually left behind. That gap is the punchline. It is a complete and sufficient answer for the scene the episode needed to produce. But alongside it, another answer is legible when you look at everything the show assembled about who this man actually was. He spent decades performing an identity that was not entirely the truth of him. Not dishonestly, exactly, because he was genuinely Jonathan Weed, the factory owner, in every professional and legal sense, but the fuller version of himself existed in rooms where the door was closed. In the ordinary Tuesday mornings when someone with a camera was in the kitchen, in the specific privacy that the professional performance made necessary by excluding everything that was real. The separation between those two versions of himself was the structure he inhabited. The Terminal Disease Institute is what remained when the structure came down. What he actually cared about in the register beneath the performance. What was real to him in a way the toy factory never quite was, probably because he understood, in whatever particular way his specific life had taught him, what it means to need genuine presence from people who are willing to be there without conditions. What the last stages of a life actually require from the people willing to sit with them. The show never said any of this. The building came down, the episode moved on, and Mr. Weed became simply a data point in Peter's employment history whenever the subject came up in later seasons. But the mystery is there. Sitting in the rubble of a demolished building in a fictional Rhode Island city, it has been there since the Season 3 episode that ended it. A man built a building. He kept his real life in the rooms the building did not contain. He arranged for the building to be replaced at the exact moment of his departure with a place that looked, from any angle willing to look, like the thing he had actually valued all along. Jonathan Bermuda Grass Weed. His real name was always something else. What he left behind when everything else came down was a place for people who needed exactly the kind of honesty that his professional life had not allowed him to provide about himself. Drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are and what time it is. I love seeing where these videos end up. And if this kind of slow, thorough, late-night content is what brought you here, subscribing is the best way to tell me to keep making it. Completely free, and it matters more than you might think. Section 2. Season 2, What Brian Knew About Meg. Season 2 of Family Guy aired across 1999 and 2000 in conditions that were not favorable to audience retention. Fox moved the show around the schedule repeatedly. Thursday nights against one of the most dominant comedies on NBC at the time. Tuesday nights buried against a game show that was consuming everything it competed with in the ratings. The network seemed genuinely uncertain about what they had on their hands, and the audience numbers reflected the instability of a show that could not settle into a consistent time slot long enough for casual viewers to find it reliably week after week. The episodes themselves, though, told a different story entirely. The writing in this period had a care and specificity suggesting a creative team deeply engaged with the characters they had built. Not archetypes being deployed for comic effect, but specific people with specific histories and specific ways of relating to each other that were being developed honestly across the run of the show. The warmth of the early Family Guy was not performed or signaled. It ran underneath the comedy as a genuine current, available when the story needed it and invisible when the story was somewhere else. It was the warmth of a family that was genuinely ridiculous and genuinely loved each other despite everything. And both of those things were simultaneously true. It was in this period that the show planted one of the most significant pieces of information in its entire history. It did so in a moment so casual, so embedded in the middle of a scene about something completely different, that the majority of the audience processed it as a quick throwaway joke and moved on without registering that something important had just been said. The episode is Screwed the Pooch, which is technically attributed to Season 3 but draws on the world that Seasons 1 and 2 had built and plants a seed that continues growing across every season that follows it. The central plot involves Brian, who has fathered a litter of puppies with a racing greyhound named Seabreeze and finds himself in a legal custody proceeding. Peter, attempting to help, decides to demonstrate that Brian is a responsible father figure by showing the court how much Brian knows about the Griffin children. Knowledge that Peter, with inadvertent and fairly devastating self-revelation, shows he himself does not possess. Peter begins listing facts. Brian supplies them. Chris's favorite ice cream flavor. Stewie's preferred bedtime story. Then he gets to Meg. He starts the sentence. Meg's real father is... And Brian completes it without hesitation. Stan Thompson. Meg is in the courtroom. She is sitting in the gallery, physically present for every moment of this exchange. She is wearing headphones and listening to music, and she hears nothing. The most significant revelation about her own identity is spoken clearly in the room she is sitting in, received by every other person present. Peter, the attorneys, the judge, the other gallery spectators. While she sits in the middle of it all, moving slightly to a beat she can hear that no one else can. There is no musical sting, no slow pan to the family's reaction, no dramatic pause to signal that something of consequence has just been said. The line lands like any other line and the scene continues. But something has been established that the show will carry forward, in various forms, at varying levels of engagement, across the next 20-plus years of its run. Peter Griffin is not Meg's biological father. Lois had a previous relationship or encounter or connection of some kind with a man named Stan Thompson, and Meg is the result. Stan Thompson has, by all available evidence, had no presence whatsoever in Meg's life. The entire Griffin family appears to know this. Peter knows, Chris knows, Stewie knows, and the family dog knows it well enough to state it without hesitation in a legal proceeding. The information has apparently been known long enough and distributed widely enough within the family unit that it can be cited as casual supporting evidence without anyone in the family reacting to it as if it were news. Meg alone does not know. She has apparently never been told. She goes through every depicted day of her life, understanding herself to be Peter's daughter, building her sense of family and identity and belonging on a picture that every person close to her knows to be incomplete. The precision with which this moment is constructed is worth sitting with. The writers did not simply have Meg be absent when the information was revealed. They placed her in the room and gave her headphones. She is physically present. She could hear the conversation. She is within earshot. And she still does not receive the information because she is listening to something else at the specific moment the truth is spoken. The headphones are the show's clearest possible visual statement of the condition Meg inhabits. The person who most needs to hear what is being said about her cannot hear it. Not because she was excluded, but because she was listening to something else at exactly the wrong moment. This is how truth gets missed by the people who need it most, not through elaborate exclusion, but through ordinary circumstance. The show references Stan Thompson again in the Season 4 episode Forefather, where Peter is alone for a brief moment and we get a glimpse of his internal processing. He considers, without evident emotion, what it would have been like to leave Meg with Stan Thompson when she was an infant. The thought produces no guilt, no visible psychological complexity, no sign that Peter recognizes this consideration as remarkable. It passes through him like weather and is gone. In the Season 7 episode Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, Brian says something to Meg that stands in direct tension with what he said in that courtroom. He tells her she resembles Peter. He says this in a moment when Meg is emotionally vulnerable and where the statement clearly functions as an attempt to offer comfort about her place in the family. These two moments, the courtroom revelation and this later reassurance, have never been reconciled by the show. The possibilities are real and multiple. Brian lied to protect Meg, deciding she needed the simpler story in that moment. Brian was genuinely uncertain, suggesting the Stan Thompson claim was always ambiguous rather than settled. Brian simply did not remember what he had said years earlier, or the writing room placed the line without catching the contradiction. The show has never said which of these explanations is correct. What the Stan Thompson thread does to the emotional landscape of the show goes beyond the paternity question itself and into the question of what it means for a family to organize itself around an incomplete truth. Think carefully about what it means for the treatment Meg receives from her family, which escalates from early season insensitivity into something considerably darker and more systematic in the middle and later years. If Peter genuinely knows she is not his biological daughter, the contempt directed at Meg, the casual cruelty, the pattern of her being the designated target of everyone's frustrations, all of it is happening in a context where the primary perpetrator holds a piece of information about Meg that she does not hold about herself. There is a specific kind of power in knowing someone's story better than they know it. It is not a power that requires active exercise. It is simply present in the dynamic between the knower and the not-knower, shaping how the knower relates to the not-knower in ways that do not need to be acknowledged or even consciously recognized to be operative. Peter raised a child that is not biologically his, and his response to the sustained discomfort of that arrangement was not to work harder at being the father Meg needed, but to build distance, and the private knowledge of her origins gave him something to place between himself and the full weight of the obligation. He probably did not decide to do this. It is the kind of thing that happens in the space between decisions, in the accumulated small choices of where to direct attention and care and how much inconvenience to tolerate before looking elsewhere. Lois knows everything. She has always known. She is the original keeper of the secret. She is the one who had whatever connection with Stan Thompson produced Meg. She is the one who chose to raise Meg as Peter's child without telling Meg this was a choice. And she is the one who has watched what has been done to her daughter across the seasons of the show and intervened with only occasional and never sustained effectiveness. Lois is not stupid and is not, in most contexts, cruel. The passive participation in what has been done to her daughter is more disturbing the longer you sit with it, precisely because it requires not a single dramatic choice, but a continuous series of small choices. Every conversation where the truth could have been said and was not, every moment of abuse that could have been interrupted and was not, each of which is individually manageable and collectively devastating. The mystery of Season 2 is ultimately not about who Stan Thompson is, though that question is real. The deeper mystery is about what a family becomes when one of its members moves through it inside a story that is less than complete. What it does to the person who is kept outside the whole truth. What it does to the people who are inside it over years of carrying what they carry. Whether the warmth the early show offered as evidence of the family's genuine underlying love for each other could coexist with the knowledge of what that warmth was sitting on top of. Meg moves through the show wearing headphones. This image, her in the courtroom, music in her ears, present for the revelation about herself and unable to receive it, is precise enough to function as something beyond a setup for a joke. The person who most needs to hear the conversation happening around her cannot hear it because she is listening to something else. This is not her fault. It is simply where she was when the moment arrived. And every member of her family, every person who loves her and has failed her in whatever combination of those two things applies to each of them, watched it happen and kept quiet. Stan Thompson is somewhere. His name has been spoken in a courtroom. The family dog knows it, and Meg does not. Section 3, Season 3, Brian's novel and the pages that stay blank. Of all the mysteries Family Guy built across its long run, the one that touches something most universally recognizable, the one that reaches through the animated surface of the show and finds something true about the experience of trying to create a difficult thing, is the mystery of Brian's novel. Brian has been a failed writer since the show began. Not a writer between projects, not a writer whose work fell short of his ambitions, not a writer in productive fallow, a writer who has been working on the same novel for years without finishing it. The novel is referenced in the first season. It is mentioned in the middle seasons. It is alluded to in the later seasons. Across the entirety of the show's run, across every evolution of Brian's character and every deterioration of it, the novel stays exactly where it started. Unfinished, in progress, always about to be returned to. In the later seasons, the treatment of this fact uses it primarily as evidence of Brian's pretension. He performs the intellectual life of a serious writer without having produced anything that warrants the performance. The gap between the self-image and the evidence is the joke. It is not entirely an unfair joke. But in Season 3, when the show was doing its most careful and specific character work, the novel was handled differently. It was treated as something genuinely real about Brian's interior life, rather than simply as a prop in a comedy about misplaced self-regard. To understand what the novel actually is, what Brian is trying and failing to write, you have to think seriously about what kind of creature Brian actually is. He is biologically and literally a dog. He has a dog's body. He will live, absent catastrophic interruption, somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 years. He will age on a timeline faster than every human being he cares about. He will watch the family he has embedded himself in move through the stages of a human lifetime, while he moves through his own on a different and considerably faster schedule. He is also, in every meaningful psychological and emotional sense, not a dog at all. He uses language at a level of sophistication exceeding most of the humans in his life. He has an emotional interior of real complexity. He has a reading life, a history of relationships, opinions about things that matter, and opinions about things that do not, the ability to distinguish between them. He is, in the fullest psychological sense, a person. He is not, in the fullest biological sense, a person. He occupies a position in the world for which there is no established template, no community of creatures sharing his specific experience, no framework for understanding what his life means or how it should be navigated. This is the material of the novel, the real one. At the center of the book, Brian is trying to write is the question of what it means to be Brian Griffin, to be fully, genuinely, thoroughly conscious inside a form that the world reads as something else entirely. What it means to love people who will outlive you. What it means to want recognition and meaningful work and the sense of having done something with your days while being, in a specific and inescapable biological sense, not quite the kind of creature that the institutions and frameworks around recognition and meaningful work were built for. What it means to live in the gap between categories, with no model for how this particular life should be lived. This is why the novel cannot be finished. Not because Brian lacks discipline, though the evidence suggests his relationship with long-term commitment is genuinely complicated. Not because the drinking and the social life and the string of romantic misadventures interfere, though they do. The real reason is that finishing the novel would require Brian to sit down with the full truth of his own experience and write it clearly and honestly. And honest writing about yourself requires a willingness to look at the parts that are uncomfortable, the parts where what you believed you were capable of and what you have actually done diverge in ways that are hard to reconcile. The novel, if written honestly, would require Brian to look at what he is. Not the performed version, the dog who quotes Faulkner and carries himself with the confidence of someone who has decided that intelligence is his defining characteristic. The actual version, the creature living in the gap between human and animal, between aspiration and circumstance, between the life he wanted and the life that was available to something like him. Writing that clearly enough to be worth reading would mean being willing to see it clearly enough to write it, which means being willing to see it at all. An unfinished novel exists in a state of pure potential. It can be anything. It carries within it every possibility of what the writer might be capable of, untested, undemonstrated, protected by the fact of its incompleteness. The moment the novel is finished and released into the world, it becomes exactly what it is, with its limitations, its failures of nerve, the places where the reach exceeded the grasp. For Brian, whose entire identity rests on the premise of being capable of something significant, the finished novel is an existential risk that the unfinished novel is not. The unwritten novel proves the great writer exists as potential. The written novel is whatever it actually turns out to be. Season 3 contains an episode called Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows, in which Brian develops a friendship with a bedridden elderly woman named Pearl, a former singer who never quite achieved what she had hoped for her life. The friendship is genuine and conducted without performance. It requires nothing from Brian except honest attention, which is different from what most of his relationships ask of him. After Pearl's death, Brian writes about her. He produces something specific and true and emotionally real, something that captures who she actually was rather than who he wished she was. He can do it. When the subject is another person, when the writing is in service of someone else's life and experience rather than his own, Brian can write with real precision and genuine feeling. The block is precisely located. It is only when the lens turns toward himself, toward the honest accounting of his own experience, that the operation starts. The mystery of Season 3 is the mystery of the blank pages. What Brian would have said if he could have found the nerve to say it. What the real book was. What an honest accounting of his own life, written without the protection of irony or the honest management of distance, would look like from a creature who carries all of these contradictions simultaneously. The show never found out. The novel never got finished. The blank pages remained blank season after season as the comedy around them got less careful and less interested in what they actually meant. But in Season 3, they meant something real, and the outline of what they meant is still there for anyone who wants to look. Section 4. Season 4, The Evil Genius. They decided to retire. Season 4 brought Family Guy back from cancellation on a wave of genuine fan enthusiasm generated by years of Adult Swim reruns and strong DVD sales. Within its early episodes, the writers made a creative decision about Stewie Griffin that would define the character for every season that followed. They retired the evil genius. Not entirely and not immediately. They kept the name, the voice, the physical design. But the architectural logic of villainy that had made the original Stewie one of the most genuinely original characters in animated television history was systematically dismantled and replaced with something considerably softer. To understand what this meant and what was lost, you have to hold clearly in mind who Stewie was across the original 3 seasons. He was 1 year old. He had a football-shaped head, a yellow shirt, red overalls, and a British accent that landed somewhere between theatrical villain and genuine menace. His primary life goal was to kill his mother. His secondary life goal was world domination. He built weapons, laser guidance systems, mind control devices, weather alteration machines, time-sensitive apparatus of various destructive applications. He plotted with the strategic patience of someone who had been studying geopolitics since before most of the adults in the show had learned basic arithmetic. The comedy was structural. It lived entirely in the gap between what Stewie appeared to be, a baby in a high chair eating strained carrots, and what he actually was, a calculating, capable, genuinely dangerous figure who happened to be 12 months old. The wider the gap in any given scene, the funnier the scene. The writers kept finding new configurations of the same essential contrast, and the contrast kept working. Underneath the comedy, running as a quieter current through the early Stewie material, was a thread the show kept approaching without fully entering. His hatred of Lois specifically, not of obstacles in general, not of all authority figures, but of his mother in a targeted and sustained and personal way, was explained by the show's standard joke as resentment of his prenatal experience. 9 months in the womb, his ovarian bastille, my madre, and he has been holding the grudge ever since. This is clearly a joke rather than a genuine psychological account. A character constructing precision-guided weapon systems and running long-term strategic planning for global domination is not doing so because he was inconvenienced before birth. The joke explanation sits on the surface. Underneath it, the show kept gesturing at something that it never named directly. The more honest reading of early Stewie is that his obsession with Lois is displacement. That what he needs from her and cannot ask for directly, in the specific, inarticulate way that need operates in children before they have full language for it, has been converted, through whatever psychological process was available to him, into its observable opposite. The schemes and the weapons and the declarations of forthcoming domination are the language available to a character who cannot say simply, "My mother does not see me the way I need to be seen," and her failure to see me feels in the register where children experience things like a fundamental betrayal that justifies elaborate response. This reading makes early Stewie not a villain, but a person in acute pain who constructed an extremely sophisticated defense system around the pain. The world domination plans are not really about world domination. They are about being, in some controllable and self-defined sense, the one who determines the terms of the relationship with the person who matters most, and who keeps failing to be sufficient. The Season 6 two-parter. Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie came closest to following this thread toward its conclusion. Stewie achieves the goal. He kills Lois. He takes over the world. He gets the thing he has been working toward since the very first episode, and the world that results is a dystopia. Gives him nothing he actually needed, leaves him exactly as isolated and unsatisfied as before. The episode was honest about this. It knew the goal was never the right goal. It built the story specifically around the revelation that domination does not deliver what was missing. And then the simulation reveal. None of it happened. Reset. The show retired Stewie before the arc could arrive at whatever destination it had been building toward. The softer, warmer, more emotionally accessible Stewie who replaced him was a genuine character who generated some of the show's most emotionally honest material. The friendship with Brian gave the show things the original version could never have produced. But the original was one of a kind. There was nothing else like the evil genius baby in animated television. The later Stewie was one of many, a searching, insecure, complicated animated character who happened to wear the same clothes as something that had been genuinely unprecedented. The show chose a safer, more commercially accessible direction over the one that was most original. And the story the original Stewie was building toward, the destination his arc was moving toward before the writers decided he had already been somewhere long enough, is the mystery of Season 4. Section 5. Season 5, The Mayor and the Logic Nobody Can Follow. There is a character who has been present in Family Guy's world since Season 2, and who represents a mystery of a particular and understated kind, not dramatic or dark, but strange in a way that accumulates across many seasons of appearances without ever being fully explained. His name is Adam West. He is the mayor of the town. He has been the mayor of the town for the entire run of the series, through every election cycle, every administrative controversy, every decision that left the citizens of Quahog visibly confused about what their government was doing. What Mayor West has done with the authority of his office across his many seasons of presence includes spending a meaningful portion of the municipal budget on a large cat skeleton of no specified civic purpose, declaring a personal war against a soup company over a perceived slight, filling a public pool with coleslaw, attempting to acquire the letter H from an unspecified seller for an unspecified reason, declaring himself legally married to the Hamburglar, reclassifying the town's geese as terrorists and pursuing their legal prosecution, and administering the general business of the city from a place of absolute internal confidence that never once registers the possibility that any of this might seem unusual to an outside observer. He is not corrupt in the conventional sense. Conventional corruption involves doing nothing because someone paid you to do nothing, or doing specific wrong things because they have been commissioned. Mayor West is intensely, enthusiastically active. He is enormously committed to his objectives in any given episode. The issue is not in action or venality, it is that his decision-making apparatus is oriented toward targets that nobody else can identify as targets. Season 5 gives him his most revealing episode, It Takes a Village Idiot and I Married One, where Lois briefly wins the mayoralty and then loses it when she discovers that actually governing requires compromises she finds unacceptable. The episode is primarily Lois's story. But the details around Mayor West illuminate something important about the specific quality of his administrative failure. He knows about the lake pollution. This is established directly. Lake Quahog has been contaminated by industrial runoff for years, causing measurable harm to public health. Mayor West has been in office throughout and has done nothing. The episode initially frames this as conventional political corruption, a mayor protecting factory owner donors. But this framing does not fit the established character at all. Mayor West does not do things for money or political benefit. He does things because they capture his interest. The cat skeleton captured his interest. The letter H captured his interest. The lake, with its documented contamination, did not. This is more genuinely disturbing than corruption in a specific way. Corruption is at least legible. It has a logic that, while wrong, can be understood. A man who ignores a public health crisis because the cat skeleton was more interesting is operating from a framework that cannot be addressed in the normal vocabulary of political accountability, because accountability assumes a shared framework of what matters, and Mayor West does not share it. The deeper mystery of the character, across his full run of appearances but with particular clarity in Season 5, concerns who he was before he became this. Adam West was Batman. In the cultural moment when that meant something, the 1960s television portrayal, committed and earnest and completely serious about embodying heroism, he was one of the most recognizable symbols in American popular culture. He was the good guy. He stood for justice and intelligence and the idea that problems could be solved by someone with sufficient capability and commitment. That moment passed Syed. The symbol aged into a world that had moved on from the specific hope it represented. The man who embodied the symbol had to figure out what came next. Mayor West is the figure that came next. The man who was once Batman now governs a small fictional city through the logic of a private priority system that no one else can access. The heroism he embodied in costume has not transferred it into governance. It has transformed into something that looks, from outside his head, like complete disconnection from the shared reality of municipal responsibility. The town keeps re-electing him. This remains the most interesting fact about Mayor West across all his seasons of screen time. Whatever he has done with the budget, the voters return him. They have adapted to him the way communities adapt to persistent, predictable strangeness, by incorporating it into the baseline facts of local life. The mayor is this way. He has always been this way. This is known. And in a town that contains all the other accumulated strangeness of Quahog, Rhode Island, a mayor who follows only his own logic may represent not the most unusual thing about the place, but simply the version of the unusual that gets to wear a sash. Section 6. Season 6 is us. Is any of this actually happening? Season 6 contains the episode that reorganized the fundamental rules of Family Guy's universe in ways the show never fully acknowledged and has never addressed directly. The reorganization arrived at the end of the two-part story, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie. The most dramatically ambitious story the show had attempted up to that point, committed to a sustained arc, willing to develop consequences in real time across 2 full episodes. Stewie achieves the goal. He kills Lois. He takes over the world. He gets the thing he has been working toward since the first episode of the series. The world that results is a dystopia that gives him nothing he actually needed. The episode was honest about this. It knew the goal was the wrong goal, and it built the story specifically around demonstrating that domination does not deliver what was missing underneath the desire for domination. Then the reveal. A simulation. A program Stewie had been running on a computer in his bedroom, processing enough real-world data to be indistinguishable from actual events from the inside. Brian, on learning this, says what the audience is thinking. Everything they just watched has been made meaningless. The show accepts the point and moves on, but it left something behind that cannot be retrieved. By establishing that Stewie has simulation technology, a system capable of producing an experience of reality so complete that nothing inside it can reveal itself as constructed. The show created a permanent ambiguity in its own universe. The machine is real. The capability is confirmed within the explicit text of the show. The machine has not been shut down. Season 8's Forget-Me-Not confirms this further. In that episode, Stewie uses his simulation technology as a social experiment, rendering Peter, Brian, Joe, and Quagmire amnesiac within a controlled environment to test whether their friendship is genuine or merely circumstantial. The subjects inside the simulation do not know they are inside it. They experience it as real. Their choices, their emotions, their discoveries about each other happen within a constructed reality they have no means of detecting as constructed. 2 separate episodes have now confirmed within the show's explicit text. Stewie runs simulations regularly. The technology is thorough enough that subjects cannot detect their simulated condition, and the machine remains operational. Once the audience knows this, the universe of the show changes in a way it cannot undo, not in the broad speculative sense that attaches to any long-running show eventually, in the specific textual sense that the show itself established the rules. Those rules now apply to the show's own events. The machine is there. Events can be generated and then reversed. The question of which events are real cannot be definitively answered from the inside of a world where the inside of a simulation is indistinguishable from the outside. The episodes across the show's middle and later seasons in which consequences fail to accumulate where they logically should, in which characters behave in ways inconsistent with established characterization, in which someone knows something they should not, in which the effects of major events simply do not appear in subsequent episodes. These almost certainly reflect the realities of a production moving faster than careful continuity tracking allowed. That is the real explanation. But within the world the show established, the simulation technology provides a different explanation. Consistent with the rules. Possible within the established logic. Stewie ran a test. The test ended. The world reset. Family Guy, after Season 6, is a show in which nothing dramatic can be fully trusted to mean what it appears to mean, because the show itself established the conditions under which nothing dramatic is required to mean what it appears to mean. The machine is still in the bedroom. The 1-year-old who controls it has been 1-year-old for over 2 decades. The ambiguity is structural and permanent. Section 7. Season 7. The Long History of Glenn Quagmire. Glenn Quagmire is built, on the comedy surface of the show, around a single defining characteristic deployed with remarkable consistency across his entire run. His relationship with women, the specific, inexhaustible enthusiasm that generates his scenes and his jokes, and his place in the social ecosystem of Spooner Street, is his signature. The show returns to this note reliably across many seasons and many contexts, and Quagmire hits it with professional consistency every time. Underneath that surface, Season 7 reveals a character with considerably more depth than the comedy allows to appear. The episode Jerome is the New Black contains the speech Quagmire delivers to Brian about why he hates him. The speech deserves serious attention, not for what it says about Brian. It is accurate about Brian, but that is a different conversation. But for what it reveals about Quagmire himself. The speech is precise. Every point it makes is supported by depicted events. There is no exaggeration, no unfair characterization, no argument built on misrepresentation. Quagmire has been watching Brian carefully across years and has organized those observations into a coherent critique that he delivers with the calm of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and decided this is it. The ability to do this is not the ability of a shallow person. Observing someone closely over an extended period, organizing those observations accurately into a coherent assessment, identifying the gap between what they present and what they actually are, and articulating that gap clearly without losing composure. This requires intelligence and genuine attentiveness, and a specific kind of patient commitment to seeing things accurately. Quagmire has all of it. The comedy surface of his character, which foregrounds his appetites and various legal complexities, almost entirely conceals the fact that he watches the people around him with real care, files what he sees, and can, when the moment arrives, be more accurate about who someone has become than almost anyone else in the show's world. Season 8's Quagmire's baby extends what Season 7 establishes. A daughter, Bnama Saye, Annalie Aina, arrives on his doorstep in a basket with a note. Her mother, a previous one-time connection, could not or chose not to raise her and has left the child with him. Quagmire's initial response is denial, which is entirely in character and understandable. DNA testing establishes paternity. The baby performs the characteristic head bob. He accepts the situation. He tries to be her father. Not as a quick comedic beat. He genuinely attempts to reorganize his daily life around a child's presence and needs. He fails because the specific structure of his life, built without any allowance for sustained, selfless attention, organized around the complete absence of sustained obligation to anyone else, is incompatible with what a baby requires. Not because he is a bad person, because his days were built for a specific kind of freedom, and a baby is the specific negation of that freedom. He puts Annalie up for adoption. Almost immediately he regrets it. He goes to find her. He arrives at the home of her adoptive parents and watches through a window. She is happy. She is warm and cared for by people who can be fully present for her in a way that Quagmire has been honest enough with himself to acknowledge he currently cannot be. He leaves. He tells himself he will see her in 18 years. The joke is there and it lands. But underneath the joke is the episode's actual content. A man who made the harder, more loving choice, who looked at his own limitations with unusual honesty and chose the option that was genuinely best for his daughter, rather than the option that would have been best for his self-image as a father. That is not the behavior of the character the comedy surface has been presenting. The deeper mystery is about what produced this person. What history generates someone simultaneously capable of that specific, clear-eyed parental love and incapable of sustaining its daily conditions? What happened in the military years, the years before Spooner Street, the blank biographical space between the fragments the show provided and the fully formed adult who arrived in the neighborhood? His father, Ida, who transitioned during the show's run and became a woman, in an episode the series handled with more sensitivity than anyone expected, adds a dimension the show never fully developed. Quagmire grew up with a parent whose interior life was entirely invisible from the outside, who presented one version of themselves publicly while another version existed only in private. Growing up alongside a hidden truth teaches specific things about the gap between surfaces and what lies beneath them, about why it might feel safer to stay on the surface, about why performance might feel more manageable than disclosure. Quagmire's behavior, maximally surface level, built around encounters that require nothing sustained or vulnerable from either party, looks in this context like something he learned before he was old enough to evaluate it. He watches. He files what he sees. He can be devastatingly accurate about others when he chooses to be. And somewhere beneath the persona the show has been running for its entire duration, there is a person with a history the show built carefully and never fully told. Section 8. Season 8. What Brian Kept in the Bank. Brian and Stewie is the 150th episode of Family Guy. It aired in May 2010. It is 30 minutes long, contains no cutaways, has no subplot, no supporting characters, no moment of tonal relief from the single sustained register it occupies from beginning to end. 2 characters, 1 location, all night. They are locked in a bank vault over the weekend. An accident, the door closing on them at the end of the business day before they could leave. The early portion of the episode is physical comedy of a deliberately drawn-out and unpleasant variety that serves a specific dramatic function. It strips the social surfaces that normally insulate these 2 characters from genuine contact. They are dealing with something basic and embarrassing and unavoidable, and the usual social evasions have nowhere to go in the confined space of a sealed vault. They drink. Brian has scotch in the deposit box. They talk through the night in the specific way people sometimes talk when the normal social exits have been removed, more honestly than usual, further beneath the performances they normally maintain. The next morning, Stewie asks why Brian has a gun. Brian is a committed gun control advocate. Stewie notes this. He notes that Brian cried after the Columbine massacre. He asks why this person, with these convictions, keeps a firearm in a bank vault. Brian deflects. He tries several approaches. None of them work because Stewie knows him too well and has been too close to him for too long for the standard deflections to function. Brian tells him he keeps the gun for the day when he decides he no longer wants to live. He keeps the scotch for a last drink before that day arrives. He has made these arrangements deliberately and practically, placed them outside his daily environment, but accessible when he would need them, maintained the arrangement over time as a standing contingency plan. He says his life feels like too much. He says he cannot find meaning. The things he was supposed to want have not arrived in forms that belong to him. He says he does not know what his purpose is. Stewie's response is the most emotionally honest moment in the episode and possibly in the entire run of the series. He does not argue. He does not offer reassurance that would feel hollow because it is disconnected from anything real. He says one specific and true thing. Brian is the only person who understands him. Brian gives his life something that nothing else provides. He asks Brian to read to him, not to fix the problem, not to resolve the gun or the scotch or the years of not finding what he was looking for, just to stay through the night, to be present, to read a story, which is one of the most ordinary and human things one person can offer another. Brian reads. The vault opens in the morning, they leave. The episode received significant critical recognition. The writers understood they had made something that exceeded the show's usual register. And then, across the seasons that followed, they largely chose not to return to it. For any viewer who watched that episode carefully and then continued watching the show, Brian carries a shadow in every subsequent scene. He is always, at some level, the character who made practical arrangements for his own ending and maintained them alongside the dinner party conversations and the political arguments and the wine. Both things are simultaneously true. The character who goes to parties and argues about contemporary fiction, and the character who arranged his exit in advance. The first version appears in more episodes. The second is always somewhere in the room. Section 9. Season 9, the bestseller that told the truth. Season 9 is the season of Brian writes a bestseller, which functions in retrospect as the clearest portrait the show ever offered of the specific quality of Brian's failure. Not the failure of ambition or discipline, but the failure of honesty. The failure to produce the real thing when the easy thing was available and would work. Stewie encourages Brian to write something, anything, a finished piece of work. Just see what comes of it. The encouragement is genuine. Brian writes a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It. The title is its own argument about what the book is. It is calibrated for maximum accessibility rather than intellectual seriousness. It is not the novel. It is not the real thing. It is the thing that was easiest to produce under the conditions available. The book becomes a massive bestseller. Brian is famous. People say it changed their lives. And he becomes, with a speed that the episode does not attempt to soften, completely insufferable. Specifically towards Stewie, the person who encouraged him, who created the conditions for the success, who has been the most consistent source of genuine belief in Brian across the run of the show. The episode is widely cited as Brian at his worst. The behavior is indefensible on its face, but the question underneath the behavior is where the episode's real content lives. Why does this particular success produce this particular response? Why, when something that resembles what he always claimed to want finally arrives, does it generate not gratitude or satisfaction, but this specific cruelty toward the specific person who made it possible? The answer is in what the success revealed. Brian's identity had been organized around a specific self-image. Serious literary figure in waiting, intelligence that would eventually be proven by the novel, aspirations that were real and substantial even if undemonstrated. As long as the novel remained unfinished, this self-image was safe. The finished novel could be anything. The great writer existed as possibility. The self-help book destroyed this protection because when Brian actually sat down under real conditions, with real time pressure, with real encouragement, with a real opportunity, what he produced was the easy thing. The gap between the self-image and the evidence became, with the bestseller's existence, impossible to maintain. Stewie witnessed this. Stewie was present in the room when Brian chose the easy path over the real one. And Brian cannot forgive Stewie for being there because you can revise your understanding of yourself when you are the only observer. And the revision becomes considerably harder when someone else was watching at the moment that mattered. The contempt directed at Stewie is contempt for the mirror. Stewie reflects, simply by existing and knowing what he knows, the specific thing Brian most needs not to see about himself. The cruelty is proportional to the discomfort of what is being reflected back. The novel stays unfinished. The bestseller exists in the world. And in the space between those two facts lives the complete truth about Brian Griffin and what he was always most afraid to find out. Section 10. Season 10, The Hurricane and the Scapegoat. Seahorse Seashell Party is the Season 10 episode that generated more sustained argument from Family Guy's audience than almost anything else in the show's middle years. Not controversy about shock value, not debate about whether a joke went too far. Genuine, engaged argument about what the episode said and whether what it said was honest or cruel or, most likely, accidentally both at once. The Griffin family is trapped in their house by a hurricane. No one can leave. Meg, after years of accumulated abuse from every direction in her family life, does something the show had never previously allowed. She stands up and tells her family exactly what she thinks of them. The speech is precise and accurate. Every specific behavior she names is something the show has depicted. She is not performing distress. She is being honest, at length, and with real specificity about what has been done to her and what it has got her. For a moment, the episode seems to be moving towards something real. An accounting, a confrontation with the pattern that would acknowledge Meg as a person and potentially begin to address the damage. Then the pivot. Without Meg absorbing the family's negative energy, the dynamic collapses. The surplus of frustration and grievance that she had been absorbing distributes itself across the remaining family members, and they turn on each other. The episode demonstrates that the Griffin family cannot sustain itself without someone occupying the position at the bottom of its hierarchy. The episode ends with Meg withdrawing everything she said. She accepts her role because the family cannot function without it, and someone has to hold that position, and it has been her long enough that the reversal would cost too much. There are two readings of this ending that are both simultaneously real. The first, the show retreated. It got close to examining what it had been doing to Meg for seasons and chose the option that preserved the status quo. The ending is a failure of nerve dressed as narrative choice. The second is clinical and more disturbing. In family systems psychology, the identified patient is the family member who carries the visible dysfunction, who presents as the problem, who absorbs the surplus of the family's negative energy, while the deeper structural issues producing their position remain invisible and unaddressed. Families like this sustain themselves by finding one member who can absorb what the rest cannot carry, and by ensuring, usually without conscious intention, that this member stays in position. The Seahorse Seashell Party depicts, with uncomfortable accuracy, what happens when the identified patient attempts to step out of the role. The system reacts to restore equilibrium. The cost of refusing is made visible. Look at what happens to us without you absorbing this. And the identified patient returns to position not out of genuine consent, but out of the understanding that the destabilization of the alternative is more than the family can currently survive. This is how these dynamics operate in actual families. The accuracy of the depiction is the episode's real argument, and the accuracy is why the ending is genuinely disturbing rather than simply lazy. Because it depicts not a failure of storytelling, but a true thing about the mechanism by which certain families maintain themselves at the ongoing expense of the person least equipped to leave. Section 11. Seasons 11 and 12. The Death That Was Never Going to Stick. In November 2013, Family Guy killed Brian Griffin. Season 12, Episode 6. Life of Brian. Brian and Stewie are playing street hockey outside the house. Stewie goes inside for his knee pads. A car comes around the corner too fast. Brian is struck. He dies at the veterinarian's office in pain with the family around him. The scene carries genuine weight. The grief in it is not managed by immediate comedy. Stewie's devastation is specific and unmediated. A new dog named Vinny arrived. The show committed to the new direction for 2 episodes. Then, in Christmas Guy, Season 12, Episode 8, 2 episodes later, Stewie acquired a time travel device from a future version of himself and used it to go back to the moment before Brian was struck. Brian survived. Vinny was erased from the timeline. Seth MacFarlane confirmed after the fact the death was always intended as temporary. Brian was always coming back. The fan response to the death was enormous. The response to the resurrection was relief palpable enough to dominate entertainment news for multiple days. The show generated maximum engagement and then resolved it by restoring exactly what it had removed. The mystery here is not about what happened. That is clear. The mystery is what the decision and its rapid reversal revealed about the show's fundamental relationship with consequence. Family Guy had established, across many seasons, a pattern of resisting permanent change. The elastic quality of the show's universe, its reliable return to the status quo after disruptions, was partly structural necessity and partly acquired habit. The writers had learned across many years that the audience was most comfortable with the world it knew. Brian's death was a test of whether the show could commit to a real consequence, the kind that would require everything following it to be genuinely different. The answer was no. The answer was delivered within 2 episodes, barely a month of real time, which meant the grief the audience brought to the event never had time to settle into anything permanent before it was resolved. The show learned from this that it could generate the emotional response that real consequence produces without following through on the consequence itself. The threat was sufficient to produce the response. The execution was optional. And once you have confirmed this experimentally, the relationship between the story and its audience changes in a way it cannot fully recover from. After Brian's death and resurrection, every major event in Family Guy carried an invisible asterisk in the viewing experience. The stakes are real, probably. They are not certain. The audience knew the outer limit of what the show was willing to do, which turned out to be not quite that. Knowing the outer limit changes how you inhabit the space inside it. The show purchased enormous short-term engagement with this event and paid for it in the currency of long-term dramatic credibility. The payment is invisible in any individual episode and visible across the show's later run as a whole. Section 12. Seasons 13 through 23. The Deep History of a Town. Everything in the preceding sections connects to the larger world the show has been constructing across its entire run, a fictional Rhode Island city with more accumulated history and more carefully embedded lore than it usually receives credit for, built up layer by layer across 2 decades of storytelling. Quahog, Rhode Island, founded in 1638 by a Puritan settler named Miles Chatterbox Musket. Nearly 4 centuries of history separate that founding moment from the show's present day, and the creative team reached back into it across multiple episodes, constructing a place that has been accumulating its specific character across a very long time. The Griffin family's roots in American history extend further than their suburban present suggests. Through the historical flashback episodes, the show established that the Griffins have ancestors at significant moments in American history. Most meaningfully, Nate Griffin, enslaved in the 19th century, is established as Peter's direct ancestor. This connection runs through a side of the family that Peter's appearance gives no visible indication of, and the show engaged with this ancestry in episodes of varying quality and depth. The distance between Nate Griffin's life and Peter Griffin's life, the full span of American history compressed into that distance, everything that happened across those generations, is something the show touched without committing to. There is a version of the Griffin family story that understands the comedy of Peter's obliviousness as something resting on a history it never quite acknowledges. The show gestured at that version without fully inhabiting it. Peter's own paternity history mirrors, with uncomfortable precision, his relationship with Meg. He was raised by Francis Griffin, a rigidly religious man who knew throughout Peter's childhood that he was not Peter's biological father. The suppressed memories surfaced in Season 5. Peter's 2 dads show a series of moments in which Francis told Peter the truth, told him directly and repeatedly, in contexts specifically selected to ensure the information would not be retained. Said when Peter was too young to process it, said in the middle of nightmares. The truth delivered in the form of a statement that is technically accurate and practically ineffective. Francis loved Peter in the complicated way that difficult people love the people they have committed to, imperfectly, through criticism and maintains standards, and that the kind of presence that does not announce itself as warmth, but is nonetheless there. He stayed. He raised the boy. He told him the truth about his parentage in the only form he was capable of delivering it, which was the form that guaranteed it would not take effect. The parallel to Meg's situation is exact enough to seem deliberate. The man who grew up not knowing his biological father, who learned the truth as an adult through suppressed memories unlocked in a therapy office, is the same man keeping the same secret from his own daughter. The cycle did not break when Peter became a parent. The available pattern was the one he moved into. Now Herbert, the elderly neighbor, present in the neighborhood since season 3. The walker and the whispery voice and the dog named Jesse who mirrors his physical condition. The comedy the show built around him rests on a history that the series confirmed in season 9's German guy and then largely moved past. He is a World War II veteran. He served in the Army Air Corps. He was captured by the Germans. He was imprisoned in a concentration camp run by Franz Schlecknacht, a man who also ended up as a Quahog resident and appears in that episode as Herbert's former captor. The specific reason Herbert was sent to the concentration camp rather than treated as a standard prisoner of war: the Germans found photographs of young boys in his wallet. They interpreted these as evidence of homosexuality, which was among the identities the Nazi regime systematically persecuted and imprisoned. He was a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp for who he was. He survived the war. He came home. He came home to an America that maintained its own systematic legal persecution of homosexuality for decades after the war ended. A country that had mobilized its full resources to defeat the regime that imprisoned him for his identity, and that was running its own institutional versions of that persecution through laws, police practices, and social structures for much of the following half-century. He lived through the McCarthy period, through the years of regular police raids on establishments where gay men gathered, through the AIDS crisis and the specific quality of official indifference that compounded it, through the slow, contested, still incomplete process of legal recognition and social change. All of this is in Herbert's personal history. All of it is the context for the man in the baby blue bathrobe who watches children ride their bicycles past his window. Approximately 70 years exist between his return from the war and the show's present day. The show gave us the war years and the present. Everything in between is blank. Think carefully about those decades. What it meant to be that specific person in America across that specific period of history, to have been imprisoned for an identity by a foreign enemy that the country mobilized its full power to defeat, and to then navigate a country that did not imprison, but did criminalize, marginalize, and systematically deny. To live through the slow changes, year by year and decade by decade, into something that looked like progress from a distance and was far more complicated and far more costly from inside it. The comedy the show built around Herbert requires a specific, willful blindness to this history. The jokes work as jokes only if you agree not to look at the 70 years behind them. If you look at the 70 years, the character becomes something the show's comedic register cannot hold. Not simply dark, but weighted with American history in ways that resist being laughed at cleanly. German Guy established the backstory. The show acknowledged it and went back to the comedy surface. What is certain is that Herbert's full story, the one that starts with a photograph in a wallet and runs through 70 years of American history, was built into the show and left where it was, in rooms the camera never enters, fully realized and entirely unexamined. The town itself is the container for all of these individual mysteries. A place that has been holding a specific collection of people for a very long time. A man with time travel capability who is 1 year old and has been 1 year old for over 2 decades. A talking dog. A pilot with abandoned children and uncommon perceptiveness. A paraplegic police officer who is simultaneously extraordinarily capable and routinely victimized. A World War II veteran with 70 unexamined years. A mayor who governs through private logic. And a family carrying multiple generations of withheld truth. The Pewterschmidts are part of the town's weight. Lois's family has been wealthy in this region long enough for the wealth to carry the specific gravity of inherited authority rather than earned success. Carter Pewterschmidt's comfort with power, the reflexive assumption that his preferences take priority. is not the confidence of someone who built something. It is the settled self-evidence of someone whose family's position has been a given for so long that questioning it would not occur to him as an available activity. The specific history of how that wealth was built, the transactions and relationships and economic arrangements across colonial New England that made certain families wealthy and kept them wealthy across generations, is not something the show examines. The wealth is treated as simply given. But it was not simply given. It was built in the specific way that old New England money was built, which involved specific transactions across specific historical relationships, the content of which is not examined by the show, but which is nonetheless present in the texture of Carter's authority and in the specific quality of what Lois walked away from when she moved to Spooner Street. Lois grew up inside all of that history and chose a different life. She chose Peter and the house on Spooner Street and everything that came with it, the chaos, the limited income, the constant management of consequences she did not create, the children who each needed something specific from her that she provided with varying success. She made this choice fully and has not seriously tried to reverse it. But the history she left does not disappear simply because she left it. It lives in how she understands her position in any room she enters, in the social fluency she brings to contexts that would be opaque to most of the people around her. And at the center of all of it, the Griffin ancestral history, the Pewter-Schmidt lineage, Meg's withheld paternity, Peter's withheld paternity, Herbert's 70 years, the mayor's private logic, the simulation machine in the bedroom, Quagmire's daughter seen through a window, the dog's vault, the bestseller that told the truth the author refused to face, the hurricane that revealed the mechanism keeping the family together, the death that was undone. At the center of all of it sits a family that should not, by rational analysis, hold together. The father is unreliable in ways that exceed endearing. The mother carries more than she should have to carry alone. The oldest daughter has been failed by the people whose job was to protect her. The son drifts through his life in a pleasant fog that no one has organized enough to address. The baby contains a history of abandoned potential and redirected intelligence. The dog had his arrangements and went on going to dinner parties. They stay. All of them. Not because the situation is optimal, not because the family they have is the family any of them would design from scratch, not because the people in it have been sufficient to each other's needs or honest with each other about what they are carrying. They stay because the gravity of shared history is real, because the people who have known you the longest are so embedded in the structure of how you understand yourself that removing yourself from proximity to them is something like dismantling the scaffolding that holds your sense of who you are in place. Because the known, however imperfect and however costly, poses a different proposition than the unknown on the other side of departure. The early seasons of Family Guy understood something about family that the later seasons often forgot, but that was always in the show's foundation. That families persist not because they are good, not because they have solved their problems, not because the people in them have been kind or honest or genuinely sufficient to each other. They persist because the specific gravity of shared history creates a weight that the alternative, whatever life exists on the other side of leaving, cannot reliably counterbalance for most people most of the time. The mysteries of each season point toward this. The boss who arranged his building's demolition and replaced it with something honest. The girl with the headphones who does not know her real father. The writer who cannot face the real book. The villain retired before he reached his destination. The mayor who follows only his own logic. The simulation that made everything uncertain. The pilot who left his daughter and went back to his life. The dog with his contingency plan in a metal box in a bank. The bestseller that revealed what the author was afraid to know about himself. The hurricane that exposed the mechanism keeping the family intact. The death that was undone because the show could not follow through. The neighbor with 70 years of American history sitting in his unlit rooms. All of them are connected to each other and to the larger question the show has been living inside since its first episode aired in January 1999. What holds people together past the point where the rational case for staying has run out? What do you get from knowing someone for 20 years that you cannot get from starting over, even when what you get includes damage and disappointment, and the specific exhaustion of having watched someone fail in the same ways too many times to count? The show never answered this cleanly. It was not built for clean answers. It was built for the ongoing texture of the question itself, the daily reinstantiation of the thing that does not resolve, The family at the dinner table and the friends at the bar and the neighbors on the street, all of them carrying everything they carry, continuing anyway, for reasons that are complicated and not always flattering, and sometimes genuinely mysterious even to the people who are doing the continuing. Quahog, Rhode Island. Population, complicated. History, extensive. Secrets, ongoing. And somewhere on Spooner Street, the lights are on in the house and the family is still there. Not because they earned it or because they deserve it or because any of them have fully figured out how to do this right, because they are still there. And being still there night after night and episode after episode and season after season is its own kind of answer to the question, even when it is the only answer available. The mysteries stay open, the town keeps its secrets, and the family, against all the evidence and all the reasons otherwise, continues. Thank you for making it all the way to the end of this one. It was a long walk tonight, and I mean it when I say the company is appreciated. When you wake up, drop a comment and tell me which mystery stayed with you, which one you are still thinking about now that it is quiet and the screen has gone dark. I read every single comment, and if this is the kind of content that brought you here, slow, thorough, unhurried, subscribing is how you tell me to keep making it. It does not cost anything, and it means more than you might expect. Sleep well. Extended Deep Dive. The world of Quahog, connections, loose threads, and the lore of the show, built without meaning to everything examined in the 12 sections above, represents only the most visible layer of what Family Guy built across its long run. Underneath those primary mysteries lies a secondary layer of connections, implications, and accumulated details that the show deposited across its many seasons without always being aware of the architecture it was constructing. This section exists to sit with those connections, to follow the threads that link the individual seasonal mysteries to each other, and to the larger picture of what kind of world Quahog actually is, and what kind of story the show is telling about it, intentionally or not. Let us start with the geography. The fictional town of Quahog is positioned in the show's mythology as a small city in Rhode Island, modeled loosely on the actual city of Cranston, which sits just southwest of Providence. Rhode Island itself is the smallest state in the United States, a fact the show occasionally uses for local color. But the fictional Quahog has a specific relationship to its geography that goes beyond simple setting. The town's position in New England, its coastal character, its connection to a specific kind of post-industrial New England city that has been in slow transition for decades, all of this informs the texture of the world even when the show is not explicitly invoking it. New England in the late 20th and early 21st century, which is when the show is set, is a specific kind of place. It is a region that was once organized around manufacturing, and that has been adjusting to the end of that era across the decades the show covers. The happy-go-lucky toy factory that occupied Peter's professional life in the first 3 seasons is part of this picture, a surviving remnant of an industrial economy that had been declining for years and that, with Mr. Weed's death and his specific instructions for the building's disposal, simply ended rather than transitioning into something new. The brewery that replaced it as Peter's employer is another kind of surviving remnant, a local industry that has hung on where the manufacturing has gone, producing something consumable and social rather than something manufactured and exported. This economic backdrop is part of why the show's central family looks the way it does. Peter is a working-class man in a region where working-class life has been under sustained economic pressure for a generation. His intelligence, which is limited but not absent, was never going to translate into the kind of upward mobility that would have been more available in a different era. He is where he is because of the specific economic geography of the world the show placed him in, not simply because the writers decided he should be there. The early seasons understood this and built it into how Peter's world was textured. His job, his neighborhood, his social life at the bar with friends who work similar jobs and live similar lives, all of it was grounded in something real about a specific kind of American working-class existence in a specific region at a specific historical moment. This groundedness is one of the things the show lost as the seasons progressed and Peter's character became increasingly untethered from any realistic economic or social context. In the later seasons, Peter does increasingly implausible things and occupies an increasingly elastic version of his social position. and the comedy asks the audience to simply accept that he remains employed and housed regardless of the consequences of his actions. The groundedness of the early seasons. The sense that this was a real family in a real economic situation in a real part of the country was a significant part of what made the family's warmth feel earned rather than asserted. The Drunken Clam, where Peter and his friends spend their leisure time, is also part of this economic picture. It is a neighborhood bar, not a gastropub or a sports bar or any of the other contemporary bar formats, but an old-fashioned neighborhood dive where the same group of people shows up in the same seats with approximately the same frequency, because it is the place they go and they have been going there long enough that any other arrangement would require an active decision rather than simply continuing the existing habit. This kind of institution has been disappearing from American cities across the decades of the show's run, replaced by formats that serve different kinds of social purposes for different kinds of customers. The Drunken Clam is an anachronism even within the early seasons of the show, the kind of institution that was already becoming rarer when the show started and has become considerably rarer across the years it has been running. The friendship between Peter, Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland, and then later Peter, Quagmire, and Joe after Cleveland departed for his own spin-off series, is a friendship of that particular institution. They did not choose each other through deliberate social selection. They ended up in the same neighborhood, they ended up at the same bar, and proximity and repetition did what they always do. They created attachment. The friendship is not based on deep compatibility or shared values or any of the deliberate selection criteria that friendship advice usually invokes. It is based on habit and geography and the specific kind of loyalty that develops between people who have been showing up in the same place at the same time for long enough that the absence of any of them would feel like a disruption of something that has become structural. This is the most honest thing the show ever said about male friendship, and it said it mostly through the texture of how the Drunken Clam was depicted rather than through any explicit statement about what friendship is. The bar and its regulars were a picture of how working-class male friendship actually operates in practice, not through conversations about feelings or deliberate cultivation of intimacy, but through shared presence, accumulated history, and the specific comfort of knowing that the same people will be in the same seats when you walk through the door. The introduction of the various neighbors of Spooner Street over the course of the show's run adds additional texture to the community the show was building. Joe Swanson, the paraplegic police officer, was introduced in the first season and quickly became a permanent fixture. His character across the early seasons was thoughtfully constructed, a man whose disability was part of who he was rather than the entirety of who he was, whose professional competence was real and whose place in the friend group was earned rather than granted as a form of inclusion charity. The early Joe was someone Peter admired and was occasionally jealous of, which was a more interesting dynamic than the later seasons produced. As the show progressed and the friend group's dynamic became shallower, Joe was increasingly written as a target for jokes about his disability, rather than as a complex character for whom the disability was one dimension among many. The Cleveland Brown character, during his time on the show before the spinoff, contributed a specific dynamic to the friend group that the show's later seasons lost when he left. Cleveland was the most consistently even-tempered member of the group, the voice of calm reasonableness that balanced out the other members' various excesses. His eventual departure for the Cleveland show left the group without that particular quality, and the friend dynamics became noticeably more erratic and less grounded in the seasons after his exit. The spin-off itself had a complicated relationship with the mythology of the original show, and Cleveland's eventual return to Quahog when the spin-off ended was handled with varying degrees of care depending on the episode. The mythology of the Griffin family's ancestors, scattered across the historical flashback episodes that appeared throughout the show's run, constitutes one of the richest and least developed bodies of lore in the series. Beyond Nate Griffin, the 19th century ancestor mentioned in the previous section, the show populated the Griffin family tree with figures who appeared across different historical periods. Civil War-era Griffins, colonial-era Griffins, Griffins at various moments of American history. Each of these figures was usually depicted briefly and for primarily comedic purposes, but the accumulation of them across many seasons built a genuine sense of a family that has been present in the American story across a very long time. The most interesting implication of this accumulated ancestry is what it says about the Griffin family's relationship to American history and to the specific stories that American history tells about itself. Peter Griffin, in his current manifestation, is a man almost entirely without historical consciousness. He does not think about where he came from. He does not think about what his family has been across the generations that preceded him. He operates entirely in the present tense, responding to immediate stimuli without any evident awareness that he is standing at the end of a very long line of people who made choices and endured consequences that eventually produced him. The comedy of this, the profound historical obliviousness of a man whose family has been present at significant American moments across centuries, is the show's most understated running joke. It is not a joke the show tells explicitly or with any consistency. It is a joke that exists in the gap between what the historical flashbacks reveal about where the Griffin family has been and what Peter's daily behavior reveals about how much of that history has survived the passage of time to inform his present. The answer is almost none of it. The history happened, and then it stopped informing anyone in the family who came after it. This is, in its own way, a genuinely American story. The specific forgetting of family history that occurs across generations of assimilation and geographic mobility, and the general forward orientation of American culture, is not unique to the Griffins. It is the condition of most American families by the third or fourth generation. The ancestors who came from somewhere else, who endured something specific, who built something that was then modified and inherited and then largely forgotten, leaving descendants who carry the results without the context. Peter Griffin is the descendant of people who survived remarkable things. He knows almost none of the specifics of what they survived or what it cost them. He simply goes to the bar and watches television and reacts to things, which is what people do when history has been successfully compressed into the ambient conditions of a comfortable present. The show's treatment of religion, particularly in the earlier seasons, was another area where the world building was more careful than it usually received credit for. The Griffin family is nominally Catholic. Francis Griffin's religious convictions were a major character element during his appearances, and Peter's Catholicism was a recurring background detail in the early seasons. The relationship between Peter's working-class New England Catholic identity and the other dimensions of who he is, his relationship with his biological Irish father, his mother's choices, his grandfather's original name, is a picture of a specific kind of immigrant-descended American Catholic identity that the show understood from the inside. Francis Griffin's Catholicism was not a caricature. It was the Catholicism of a specific kind of Irish-American working-class family, demanding, somewhat rigid, organized around obligation and duty rather than inspiration, capable of genuine love but not always capable of expressing it in the direct, verbal forms that contemporary emotional culture values. He was a hard man because he had been raised by hard men in a tradition that understood hardness as a form of love, as the thing you gave people when you wanted them to be strong enough to survive what the world would bring. Peter's complicated relationship with Francis, the affection underneath the frustration, the need for a father's approval that persisted long after the approval became clearly unavailable, was one of the early show's most genuinely human elements. The Jewish family on the street, Mort Goldman, his son Neil, and his wife Muriel, were a consistent presence across the show's run, and were given more interior life in the earlier seasons than they received in the later ones. Mort in particular was an interesting character in the early seasons, his anxiety and his hypochondria functioning as character traits that generated sympathy as well as comedy. Neil's unrequited attachment to Meg was handled in the early seasons with more care than you might expect. He was not simply a figure of mockery, but a teenager with genuine feelings whose rejection was at least occasionally treated as something that cost him something. The various recurring characters who populated the broader Quahog community, Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons at the news desk doctor, Hartman, who appeared in medical storylines, Consuela the cleaning woman who became an increasingly prominent character in the later seasons, Principal Shepard, and the various James Woods High School figures. Each contributed to the texture of the town as a place that was inhabited by specific people living specific lives, rather than simply a backdrop against which the Griffin family's plots unfolded. The news desk dynamic between Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons was actually one of the show's more interesting ongoing setups in the early seasons. Both characters had dimensions that the show occasionally explored with real care. Tom's vanity and his failed personal life, Diane's professional ambitions, and the specific frustrations of a woman in television news in an era when those ambitions were structurally constrained. The show even gave Diana death in the later seasons that was handled with more dramatic weight than most character departures, a confrontation that ended her life and resolved a story thread that had been running quietly in the background for years. The religious community depicted in the show, the various churches and church-going characters who appeared in episodes dealing with faith and community, was handled with more complexity in the early seasons than the show's later reputation for edginess might suggest. The show was willing to make jokes about religion, always had been, but it was also willing to depict faith as something people actually had rather than simply as a target. The scenes at the Griffin family's church in the early seasons had a specificity to them that reflected someone on the writing staff who understood what that specific kind of parish community actually felt like from the inside. The social dimensions of congregational life, the way the church functioned as a community institution, rather than simply as a site of belief. All of this world building, the economic geography, the institutional landscape, the specific texture of the social world the characters inhabited, was most carefully maintained in the first 3 seasons, and then progressively simplified as the show went on, and the comedy requirements came to dominate the other considerations that had informed the early episodes. The world became less grounded, the characters became less specifically themselves, and the town became less the kind of place that produced and held specific kinds of people and, more simply, the setting in which the plots happened. But the foundations are still there, visible in the early episodes for anyone who wants to look at them. Quahog was built as a real place, fictional but specific, organized according to real principles of how communities form and persist and change over time. The lore that accumulated around it across many seasons of storytelling is more coherent and more interesting than the show's later reputation would suggest. The mysteries in each season are not isolated puzzles, but elements of a larger picture that the show was drawing, mostly without knowing it was drawing it, across its entire run. The picture is of a town where certain people end up and where the gravity of shared history makes it very hard to leave. Where the institutions that hold communities together, the bar, the church, the workplace, the school, the neighborhood itself, function not as settings but as mechanisms that create attachment, even when attachment is not entirely wanted. Where the families that form within those institutions are shaped by histories they often cannot name and carry secrets that accumulate across generations before anyone notices what they have been carrying. Where Jonathan Weed arranged his building's demolition and left behind a place for the dying. Where Meg Griffin sits in a courtroom with headphones in while the truth about her father is spoken in the room around her. Where Brian Griffin has pages that stay blank and a story he cannot quite bring himself to tell. Where the evil genius was retired before he reached his destination. Where the mayor follows a logic that nobody else can access. Where the simulation machine sits in a baby's bedroom and the question of what is real has been open since season 6. Where Glenn Quagmire watched his daughter through a window and went home. Where the vault in the bank has specific contents for specific reasons. Where the bestseller told the truth the author refused to face. Where the hurricane revealed the mechanism the family runs on. Where the death was undone because the show could not follow through. Where the neighbor has 70 years of American history that the comedy surface never quite reaches. All of these are the same story told at different scales and through different characters. They are all stories about the gap between what people present and what they carry. Between what is visible and what is real. Between the surface of a life and the interior of it. Family Guy built this world across 2 decades of storytelling. It did not always build it carefully or consistently. The later seasons let a great deal of it deteriorate into simpler formulas that were easier to produce and easier to consume. But the foundation is there. The early seasons built something genuine, and the mysteries they planted are still in the ground where they were placed, waiting for anyone who wants to find them. The town has its secrets. The family has its history. The mysteries stay open. And somewhere in all of it, the thing the show was always circling without quite naming. What it means to belong somewhere you cannot entirely explain, to people you did not entirely choose, in a life that looks, from a distance, like the sum of 100 small accidents, but that feels from inside it like the only possible version of what your life could have been. That is what Quahog is. That is what the Griffin family is. That is what all 23 seasons of complicated, inconsistent, occasionally brilliant, frequently frustrating, genuinely strange television were always trying in their way to say. The mysteries are the evidence of the trying. You do not plant seeds you do not care about. You do not build backstories for characters you have fully written off. Somewhere in the writer's room, across all the years the show was made, people cared enough about Jonathan Weed and Meg Griffin and Brian's novel and Stewie's abandoned arc to make them worth caring about, which means the questions those things generated are worth sitting with, which is what we have been doing tonight. The questions do not get answered, but they stay. That is more than most things get. Sleep Well, The Neighbors of Spooner Street, a street that holds its people. One of the quietest pieces of ongoing lore in Family Guy is what the show built around the specific geography of Spooner Street and the people who live on it. The street functions in the show not just as a backdrop, but as a kind of organism, a collection of households that have been in proximity long enough for their inhabitants to have developed the particular kind of relationship that proximity creates. Not intimacy, exactly, and not always friendship, but a specific knowledge of each other that comes from years of shared adjacency. You know the sounds of your neighbors' days. You know their cars. You know what time their lights go on and off. You know things about them that you never asked to know and that they did not intend to share. The Swansons next door are the most developed secondary household in the show's world. Joe Swanson, introduced in the first season episode A Hero Sits Next Door, was built with care in that initial appearance. He is a paraplegic police officer who became paralyzed while apprehending a criminal on Christmas Eve, a backstory that the show established clearly and then periodically returned to with genuine feeling in the early seasons. The episode of his introduction is one of the first season's best, and it works precisely because Joe is not simply a disabled character, but a specific person whose disability is one dimension of a complex characterization. Peter is initially jealous of Joe because Joe is more popular in the neighborhood, more capable in many contexts despite his wheelchair, more admired by the people around him. That jealousy about the specific feeling of being overshadowed by someone who has every apparent reason to be diminished but is not, was a real and interesting thing for the show to be exploring. Joe's wife Bonnie, who spent many seasons pregnant before eventually giving birth in the later seasons, was a character whose potential the show largely failed to develop. She had moments, particularly around her difficult and extended pregnancy and later around the strains in her marriage, where the show gestured toward a more interesting character than it was usually willing to write. The eventual birth of her baby and the complications that followed for her marriage to Joe were handled with varying degrees of care across the seasons that dealt with them. Joe's trajectory across the show's run mirrors, in its own way, the larger pattern of character decline that the show imposed on most of its figures. The man who was once the neighbor everyone admired, who Peter was jealous of, became over the seasons increasingly a figure of pity and mockery. His disability, which was part of his character in the early episodes, became in the later seasons increasingly a source of jokes rather than a dimension of characterization. His marriage to Bonnie, which was depicted in the early seasons as genuinely loving, became strained and cold as the show pushed characters toward darker, more antagonistic versions of their relationships. This trajectory is itself a mystery of sorts, not about what happened within the show's fictional world, but about what happened within the creative process that produced the show. Why did so many characters move in the same direction? From complexity toward simplification? From warmth toward coldness? From specific and grounded toward archetypal and untethered? The answer the show's critics have given is creative fatigue and declining quality control. The answer that sits underneath that, when you look at the specific patterns of how the characters changed, involves the particular way that comedy writers respond to the pressure of producing large volumes of material on a sustained basis. The specific, the grounded, the warm. These things require care and effort and the willingness to constrain your jokes to what is true of a particular character. The general, the unmoored, the cold, these are easier to write, faster to produce, and more compatible with the shock and surprise humor that the show leaned on increasingly in its middle and later years. The Quagmire household, next door on the other side of the Griffins, holds its own accumulated mysteries. Quagmire's house is the site of a great deal of activity that the show depicts only obliquely. What happens inside it is usually implied rather than shown, and the implication is consistently that the activity is of a specific and recurring kind. But there are occasional moments where the inside of Quagmire's house appears in a different light. Quiet moments, solitary ones, where the character is shown in the space he has created for himself, and the space suggests something about him that the comedy usually conceals. He has lived there for the entire run of the show. He has made no apparent effort to move, despite having the financial means that a commercial airline pilot would presumably possess. He chose to stay in this specific neighborhood, on this specific street, in this specific house, across 2 decades of the show's timeline. The reasons for this are never stated, which means the question of why he stays, what Spooner Street provides that anywhere else does not, is open in the same way the reasons why any of them stay is open. The answer, if there is one, is probably the same answer it is for all of them: the people. Not chosen people, not ideal people, not people Quagmire would have selected if given the full range of options and unlimited time for deliberate social selection. Just the people who were there when he arrived and who are still there year after year, showing up in the same bar, in the same seats. The accumulated weight of shared history being sufficient reason to stay, even when the shared history includes a great deal that is difficult and some things that are genuinely not good. This is the defining characteristic of Spooner Street as a place, and it is the characteristic that connects all the individual mysteries of the show's seasons to each other. The street holds its people, not through any magical or coercive mechanism, but through the ordinary, mundane, powerful gravity of shared time. The longer you have been somewhere with people, the harder it is to imagine being somewhere else without them. Not because the somewhere else would be worse, necessarily, because the somewhere else would require you to start over, and starting over requires more energy than most people can reliably generate when the alternative is simply continuing. Jonathan Weed had his somewhere, the kitchen on ordinary mornings, the companion with the camera, and he went to his office and ran his factory, and at the end of it all he arranged for the factory to come down and something more honest to take its place. Meg Griffin is on Spooner Street, wearing her pink hat, going to a school where she is not valued, coming home to a family that has not protected her the way families are supposed to. And she stays because where else would she go? Because the people who have failed her are still the people who are there. And there is something in being known, even imperfectly, even in failure, that is different from being unknown, and Meg has not yet found any alternative to being known by these particular people in this particular place. Brian Griffin writes his pages and does not finish them, and goes to the bar and has his opinions, and comes home to the house and sleeps at the foot of the bed. And in the bank there is a metal box with things he does not open unless he has to, and he has not had to yet. And he hopes he will not have to, and Stewie asked him to read a story one night, and he read it, and that was enough for the time being, which is what enough usually means. Stewie Griffin is 1 year old and has been 1 year old for over 2 decades. Whatever he was building toward in the original arc of his character, whatever destination the evil genius was heading for before the show redirected him, is still there, hypothetically, in the version of the story that was not told. He is older now in some sense that cannot be measured by the years on a calendar, and the plans for world domination come up less often, and the friendship with Brian has given him things the original Stewie could not have had. Whether the trade was worth it depends on what you think the original Stewie was building toward, and the show never answered that question, and so it stays open. Glenn Quagmire is in his house on the right side of the Griffin house, having conducted a life that looks from the outside like one long and elaborate avoidance of the thing. He briefly, clearly wanted the night he stood at a window watching his daughter in someone else's house, and knew that the leaving was the right thing and did it anyway. He is still in his house, his daughter is somewhere, 18 or so years old by now if anyone were tracking the timeline. And Quagmire did the loving thing and it cost him something real. And he went back to his house and his life and the bar and the friends and the specific gravity of Spooner Street. Joe Swanson is in the house on the left, and his marriage has been through what it has been through, and he is still a police officer. And the night that he stopped a criminal on Christmas Eve and ended up in the wheelchair is still the night that made him who he is in some way that the character has never fully articulated, but that the early show understood and tried to honor. The Griffin family is in their house at the center of the street, carrying everything we have discussed tonight, The histories and the secrets and the questions, and the blank pages and the unfinished things, and the lights are on, and the noise of them is probably audible to the neighbors on both sides, and they are all still there. The mysteries stay open. The street holds its people. And the thing that holds the street, the thing that holds Quahog, Rhode Island, the whole fictional construct of the place and its accumulated mythology, is the same thing that holds any place where people have been living alongside each other, long enough for the leaving to become harder than the staying. They know each other, imperfectly, incompletely, often in ways that include their worst qualities more prominently than their best. But they know each other, and knowing in this imperfect and incomplete form is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite a lot. It may even be, in certain lights and at certain hours, everything. The Lois Griffin. We did not get to know. There is a character who runs through every section of this analysis without ever being the primary subject of any of them, and who deserves her own extended consideration before we close. Lois Griffin has been the anchor of the Griffin household for the entire run of the show, and the show has consistently underused her while simultaneously depending on her. In the early seasons, Lois was built with real care. She was smart, she was patient in the specific and earned way of someone who had decided that this life was worth the patience it required. She had a past that the show gestured at periodically, a wilder version of herself that existed before the marriage and the children and the house on Spooner Street. The piano she plays is the remnant of a talent she did not give up entirely when she gave up the Pewterschmidt life. The occasional references to her earlier adventurousness were handled in the early seasons as genuine character texture rather than as punchlines. The mystery of Lois is the mystery of what the show decided she was not going to be. Because the early episodes built a Lois who was interesting on her own terms, not just as Peter's counterweight, not just as the competent one who managed the chaos that Peter generated, but as a person with her own interior life that the show occasionally touched. Her relationship with her parents, particularly the difficult dynamic with Carter Pewterschmidt, was more complex in the early seasons than it became later. Her history with Brian, a quiet, mostly suppressed thread of genuine mutual feeling that the early show handled with real delicacy, was a dimension of her character that was never fully developed, but that added real depth to the show's central domestic triangle when it was present. What the show made of Lois in the later seasons was considerably flatter. She became increasingly reactive, increasingly defined by her responses to Peter and to the children, less and less a figure with independent depth. The occasional episodes that returned to her earlier life or her own perspective felt increasingly like interruptions to the show's default mode, rather than expressions of an ongoing interest in who she actually was. The mystery of Lois is the mystery of a character who was built to carry more weight than she was eventually given. The show knew what she could be. The episodes that demonstrated this are scattered across the full run, appearing in every era, proving repeatedly that the writing capability to give Lois her full due was present. The choice not to exercise that capability consistently is one of the quieter losses in the show's long history of losses. She is the person who knows about Stan Thompson. She is the person who chose Peter. She is the person who carries the Pewterschmidt history and the working-class present simultaneously, who plays the piano she never quite gave up, who has been the competent anchor of a household that consistently asks more of her than it offers in return. She is the person who made a specific and conscious choice to build a life that was real rather than comfortable, and who has been living inside that choice for the entire run of the show. The full version of her story, the one the show occasionally glimpsed and then moved past, is one of the more interesting stories the show could have told. The mystery of Season 2 is partly about Meg and Stan Thompson, but it is also about Lois, and the choice she made and the cost of maintaining it, and the question of whether the warmth she has offered this family across 23 seasons of difficult circumstances is the evidence of love, or the evidence of something that has simply become too habitual to change. The show never quite answered that question either. It left her, like everyone else, carrying what she carried, in the house on Spooner Street, with the lights on, what the show was always about. There is a temptation, when you spend a long time looking at the mysteries embedded in a television show, to conclude that the show was secretly a different show than the one it appeared to be on the surface. That the funny, animated family comedy was actually a meditation on American history, or a study of working-class community, or a portrait of the damage that families do to each other, and the persistence that holds them together anyway. Family Guy was not secretly any of these things. It was a funny, animated family comedy that also happened to contain, particularly in its best seasons, elements of all of these things. The mysteries we have been examining tonight are not the hidden true subject of the show. They are the residue of the show caring about its characters in moments when it could have gotten away with caring less. The genuine mystery of Family Guy, the one that sits underneath all the individual seasonal mysteries and that connects all of them, is the mystery of what it means for a creative work to build more than it knows it is building. The writers who planted the details about Mr. Weed across the first season were writing jokes, but they were also building a character. The writers who had Brian state Meg's real father's name in a courtroom were writing a quick comedic beat, but they were also planting a seed that the show would carry for 20 years without ever fully tending. The writers who gave Brian a gun in a bank vault were trying to make something genuinely felt in an episode that earned its place as the 150th episode of a show that had produced many things, and relatively few of them at that register. They built more than they knew they were building. This is what serious creative work often does, and it is what distinguishes work that people return to from work that they consume once and do not think about again. The mysteries embedded in Family Guy's seasons are the evidence of that kind of building. The evidence that at various points across its long run, people were working on it who cared enough to put things in that did not need to be there, that were not required by the joke or the plot or the network order, but that were there because the people making it were thinking about who these characters were and what their lives meant, and what the world they inhabited was like. That kind of caring is worth sitting with. It is worth spending time with, even in a show that spent many of its later years giving fewer reasons to do so. The early seasons built something real, and the mysteries they built are real, and tonight we have been sitting with them, which is what this channel is for. Finding the real things in places where real things were built, and spending enough time with them to notice what they were. The mysteries of Family Guy's seasons are not solved. They stay open. That is appropriate. The best mysteries stay open because staying open is their way of remaining alive. Jonathan Weed and his demolished factory and what he left behind. Meg Griffin in the courtroom with headphones. The novel that stays blank. The evil genius and his unfinished arc. The mayor and his private logic. The simulation that called everything into question. Quagmire and the daughter he watched through a window. The gun in the vault. The bestseller and what it revealed. The hurricane and the mechanism it exposed. The death that was undone. The neighbor and his 70 years. The street and the gravity that holds it. Lois and what she chose and what she carries. All of them still there, all of them still open. All of them evidence that at some point, someone cared enough to build something that could not be finished in a single episode, and that would not be resolved in a single season, and that is still sitting in the world, waiting to be found. That is what tonight has been. Finding some of those things and sitting with them long enough to feel their weight. Sleep Well, the show that came back. What the cancellation and revival tell us about the world that was built. One of the most unusual facts about Family Guy's history, and one that shapes how the show's accumulated lore should be understood, is that it was canceled twice and returned from that cancellation once, and the shape of what it became after the return tells us something important about what the original show was and what it could not quite remain after the interruption. The first cancellation in 1999 was brief, and the show came back for additional episodes relatively quickly. The second cancellation in 2002 was supposed to be permanent. Fox ended the show after 3 seasons, the writing staff dispersed, the production infrastructure dissolved, and for 3 years Family Guy existed only in reruns and on DVD. When it returned in 2005, it returned to something different from what it had left. A changed television landscape, a changed cultural moment, a changed audience that had discovered the show in a different way than the original audience had, through the democratic medium of late-night cable reruns, rather than through the scheduled appointment of its original broadcast. The Adult Swim audience that drove the show's resurrection was substantially younger than the audience that had watched it in its original run. They encountered the show out of sequence, watching whatever episodes happened to air that night, rather than following a narrative progression. They experience Family Guy as a collection of moments rather than as an ongoing story, as clips and scenes rather than as complete episodes with beginnings and middles and ends. The viral internet moment that peaked around the same time, YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned, created a distribution mechanism that was ideally suited to the kind of television the show had always been good at making. Short, punchy, surprising sequences that worked as standalone moments, even when removed from their original context. The return of Family Guy in 2005 was therefore a return into a completely different relationship with its audience, and this different relationship shaped what the show became in its second life. A show being watched primarily for its standalone moments rather than for its ongoing narrative logic is a show that has an incentive to optimize for standalone moments at the expense of narrative logic. The cutaway gag, which had always been a feature of Family Guy's style, became more dominant in the revival years, partly because the cutaway gag was the unit of consumption that matched how the audience was actually experiencing the show. The story could be thinner, the character development could be lighter, the episode-to-episode continuity could be looser, because the audience was not primarily coming for those things. They were coming for the next surprising moment, the next unexpected joke, the next piece of content that would work just as well extracted from its context and shared online as it did in the episode it was part of. This shift in the show's relationship to its audience is the context in which all the character changes we have discussed tonight happened. Peter becoming crueler, Brian becoming more insufferable, Stewie losing the edge of his original concept, Meg becoming purely a target rather than a person. All of these happened in a creative environment that was responding, consciously or not, to the incentives created by how the show was being consumed. The shocking moment gets shared. The dark joke gets clipped. The cruel exchange generates reaction. The softer, more character-grounded content, the content that requires context to work, that requires you to know who these people are and what their history is harder to share, harder to clip, less rewarding as an isolated moment. The mysteries we have been examining tonight are, in a specific and interesting sense, the residue of the show that existed before this shift fully completed. They are artifacts of a creative process that was still thinking about these characters as people rather than as delivery mechanisms for shareable moments. Mr. Weed's story is not the kind of content that translates into a clip. Brian's novel and what it means is not shareable in 30 seconds. The Stan Thompson revelation is interesting precisely because it requires knowing who Meg is and what her life is like, which requires having watched the show with enough investment to know those things. The Vault episode is the furthest possible thing from a cutaway gag. It is 30 minutes of two characters talking in a confined space, built on the premise that you care enough about both of them to spend that long with nothing else happening. All of the most interesting lore in Family Guy requires investment. It requires the kind of watching that the show's Second Life audience was often not doing, and that the show's creative team was often not writing for. The mysteries were built when the show was still writing for the audience that watched carefully and cared about what happened to the characters over time. They were left unresolved during the years when the show was writing for a different audience with different habits and different expectations. This is not a unique situation in television history. Many long-running shows have experienced versions of this same transition. The moment when the audience that watched carefully is replaced by or subsumed into a larger audience that watches for the moments rather than for the story. What is unusual about Family Guy is how visible the transition was in the specific changes it produced in the characters, and how clearly the early lore stands apart from the later approach as evidence of what was being built before the shift happened and what was being built after. The mysteries in the early seasons were mysteries because the show was building a world that was more complex than any single episode could fully reveal. The later seasons had fewer genuine mysteries because the later seasons were not building a world in the same sense. They were generating content, which is a different activity with different outputs. Understanding this distinction is understanding why the early lore matters, even to people who continue to watch the later seasons with pleasure. The later seasons can still produce funny moments. They can still generate the kind of quick, surprising comedy that makes Family Guy recognizable as Family Guy. But the depth that the earlier seasons built, the architecture of character and history and place that gives the funny moments something real to be funny against. That depth was constructed in a specific period of the show's history and has not been significantly added to since. The mysteries we have been examining tonight are the evidence that the depth was real, that there was something underneath the surface, that the people making the show in those first 3 seasons and in the better episodes of the revival years were thinking about who these people were and what their world was like in a way that went beyond what the jokes required. The mysteries are not going to be answered. The show is too far into its run and too committed to its current approach to return to the kind of careful character work that built them, but they are there and they are real and they are worth knowing about. They are why the early seasons of Family Guy feel different from the later ones in a way that is hard to fully articulate. It is not just that the jokes were better, though sometimes they were. It is that the jokes were funnier because they were happening in a world that felt real. A world where the characters had histories that could be violated for comic effect because the histories were genuinely there. You cannot violate the history of a character who does not have one. The early show had characters with histories, and the comedy of violating them was real comedy, earned comedy. Comedy with something genuine underneath it. The later show has characters with established types, and the comedy of having those types do things consistent with their types is a different and lesser thing. It is comedy that does not require the audience to know anything except what the character's type is. Brian is the pretentious one. Peter is the stupid one. Meg is the picked-on one. Stewie is the flamboyant one. These are types, not people, and comedies built on types can be very funny in the specific way that types are funny, reliably, efficiently, without much risk. But they cannot be the other thing, the thing the early show was sometimes, the thing that makes an audience feel the weight of a joke rather than just laugh at it. The mysteries are what makes the weight possible. They are what the characters are carrying that the types do not carry. Mr. Weed's weight is specific and real and was built over 2 seasons. Meg's weight is specific and real and has been building since season 3. Brian's weight is specific and real and was most honestly acknowledged in the Vault episode and left there. All of them are carrying something that the comedy is happening in front of, and the comedy is funnier and stranger and more resonant because of what is behind it, even when the show is not explicitly invoking it. That is the argument for caring about the lore. That is the argument for spending time with the mysteries rather than dismissing them. The mysteries are the evidence that the show was, at its best, doing something more than generating content. It was building a world. And the world it built, with all its gaps and inconsistencies and dropped threads and unresolved questions, is a more interesting place to spend time than the show's current reputation would suggest. The secondary characters who carried more than their share. Family Guy's supporting cast is unusually large for an animated comedy, and the recurring secondary characters who populated the show across its long run deserve their own space in any serious examination of the world the show built. Several of them were given enough consistent characterization across many seasons to accumulate genuine depth, and several of them carry mysteries of their own that the show planted and then mostly left untended. Tom Tucker, the local news anchor, is one of the show's most underexamined figures. He appeared in the very first episode and has been a recurring presence across the entire run of the series. In the early seasons, his vanity and his failed personal life were handled with enough consistency that he functioned as a genuine secondary character, rather than simply a news desk joke delivery device. He had an arc with his son Jake Tucker, whose face was upside down, a running visual gag that the show occasionally used to explore real-feeling father-son dynamics underneath the absurdity. Tom's relationship with Diane Simmons, his co-anchor, was a sustained secondary storyline in the early seasons. A professional partnership with complicated personal undercurrents that the show handled with more intelligence than you might expect. Diane Simmons' death in the later seasons was one of the more dramatically significant events in the show's history, given how long she had been part of the world. The episode that contained it, and then there were fewer, was a departure from the show's usual format, a murder mystery episode that committed to its genre premise with real seriousness. Diane's death, and what led to it, was handled as a genuine narrative event rather than as a comedic disposal of an inconvenient character. The fact that the show was willing to do this, to give a secondary character a real ending that connected to her established history, is evidence that the world-building instinct was not entirely gone, even in the later seasons when most of the character work had become considerably less careful. Dr. Hartman, the family physician, accumulated enough consistent characterization across his many appearances that he functions as a genuine recurring figure rather than simply a medical context. His specific combination of cheerful incompetence and genuine care, the doctor who might give you wrong information but who clearly means well, is a consistent characterization that the show has maintained across many seasons. He is one of the secondary characters whose specific qualities have remained stable in a show where stability of characterization became increasingly rare. Bruce, the gay man with a southern accent who appears in various service roles across the show's run, masseur, therapist, cashier, etc., is a figure who represents one of the show's recurring techniques, the same character in different contexts, providing consistency through personality rather than through a fixed social role. His appearances are always brief and usually consist of a single exchange, but the consistency of the characterization across many seasons gives him a specific gravity in the world that characters who appear more often but with less consistent characterization sometimes fail to achieve. The Goldmans, Mort, Neil, and the briefly lived Muriel, occupied the specific social role of the Jewish family in the neighborhood, a role the show used with varying degrees of sensitivity and care across its run. Muriel Goldman's death in the middle seasons was handled as a genuine emotional event, unexpectedly serious for a character whose death the show could easily have treated as simply a way to reduce the supporting cast. The grief around her departure was real, and the show treated it as real, which is evidence again that the capacity for genuine feeling was present in the show even when the general trend was toward less of it. Neil Goldman's attachment to Meg, running from the first season through many subsequent ones, was handled with more care in the early seasons than the show usually received credit for. He was not simply a figure of mockery. He had genuine feelings that the show occasionally treated as genuine. And his persistence in the face of Meg's consistent indifference was sometimes played as the comedy of unrequited feeling, rather than simply as the comedy of an unattractive boy pursuing an unattractive girl. The early show understood the difference. The later show was less consistently interested in it. Principal Shepard and the James Woods High School environment generally were given a specific texture in the early seasons that reflected genuine attention to the specific social world of a middle-tier American public high school. The social hierarchies, the specific cruelties, the way that high school concentrates and amplifies the difficulties of adolescence, all of this was handled with more accuracy in the early seasons than a show primarily built for adult comedy had any particular obligation to provide. The attention to the high school world was attention to Meg's world specifically, and it was the same attention that gave early Meg her specific reality as a character, the normal teenager in an extraordinary family, whose ordinariness was a genuine thing and not simply a comedic inadequacy. The world of the school deteriorated in the later seasons in parallel with the deterioration of Meg as a character. As Meg became purely a target rather than a person, the school world that produced her social difficulties became purely a context for those difficulties rather than a genuine social environment with its own logic and its own inhabitants. Connie D'Amico, Meg's main rival, was a more interesting character in the early seasons, when her cruelty toward Meg was motivated by specific social anxieties rather than by pure meanness. The later seasons simplified her into an antagonist without texture, which made her cruelty less interesting and Meg's suffering less meaningful because the suffering was no longer happening in a world that felt real. All of these secondary characters, at their best, contributed to the texture of Quahog as a place that was inhabited by specific people living specific lives. The town felt real when they were in it. The world had dimensions that extended beyond the Griffin household and the Spooner Street neighborhood into the surrounding community, the school, the medical practice, the news station, the various businesses and institutions that a small city contains. The early show populated this surrounding world with enough care that it felt genuinely populated. The later show populated it less carefully, and the town felt accordingly less real, less inhabited, less the kind of place where mysteries accumulate because real things are happening to real people. The accumulated lore of the secondary characters is another layer of the world the show built and cannot entirely walk back. Tom Tucker was there from the beginning. Bruce has been everywhere. The Goldmans have been the Jewish family on the block for the whole run of the show. These presences mean something, add up to something, contribute to the specific texture of a fictional place that has been carefully inhabited for over 2 decades. Their histories, like the histories of the primary characters, are part of what makes the mysteries possible. The mysteries in any world grow out of the accumulated facts of that world. The things that were established and then not explained, the things that were implied and then not stated, the things that were built and then not developed. Secondary characters contribute to this accumulation. They are part of why the world of the show feels deeper than any individual episode fully reveals. Even in the later seasons when the new building happening on the surface had become considerably less careful than the building that happened in the first few years. The world holds its depth. The depth was built. The mysteries of each season are evidence that it was built by people who were thinking about something more than the joke in front of them. And the secondary characters are part of that evidence, accumulating in the background of the show across its long run, carrying their small pieces of the world's weight without ever being asked to carry too much of it. One final thing. Why these mysteries matter. We have been walking through this world for a long time tonight, and before we close, I want to say one thing directly about why any of it matters. Not just as entertainment, not just as a way to spend the hours, but in the deeper sense of what makes the time spent with a story worthwhile. The mysteries embedded in Family Guy's seasons matter because they are evidence of the show taking its characters seriously. Not all the time. Not even most of the time in the later seasons. But in specific episodes and across specific arcs in specific seasons, the people making the show were thinking about who these people were and what their lives meant in a way that went beyond what the jokes required. Jonathan Weed did not need to have a full interior life to serve his function in the plot. He needed to be Peter's boss, to fire Peter, to be the mechanism by which Peter kept his job or lost it. The show gave him more than that. The details accumulated across 2 seasons of his appearances, the locker room, the closed office door, the tape of the ordinary morning, the demolished building, and what replaced it, these details were not required. They were there because someone cared enough to put them there. Meg Griffin did not need to have an unanswered question about her parentage in order for the show to keep using her as a comedic target. She needed only to be the target. The Stan Thompson detail, casually deployed in a courtroom scene, was not required by any plot logic. It was there because someone was thinking about who Meg actually was, where she came from, what her story might be if anyone took the time to look at it. Brian's novel did not need to mean anything specific. It could have been a simple comedy premise. Dog thinks he is a writer. Dog has not written anything. Comedy ensues. The early seasons built something more specific than that. They built a mystery around the novel. What is it about? Why can't it be finished? What would it say if it were written? These are not questions the comedy required. They are questions that were put there because someone was thinking about Brian as a creature with a specific and interesting situation rather than simply as a type. This is what it looks like when creative work takes its subjects seriously. It looks like mysteries, like things that could have been simpler but were made more complex. Things that could have been left vague but were made specific. Things that were built for the long term rather than for the immediate joke. Not all of these things got developed the way they deserved. Most of them were eventually simplified or forgotten or converted into something easier to manage. But they were built, and the building of them, the specific care that went into their construction, is evidence that, at various points across its long run, Family Guy was made by people who gave a damn about what they were making. That is what makes the time spent with these mysteries worthwhile. Not the resolution of them. There is no resolution. Not the discovery of hidden meaning. The show is not secretly more profound than it appears. But the encounter with the care that was present in certain moments of the show's production. The evidence that people were thinking about these characters as if they mattered, which made the characters matter in ways that outlasted the specific episodes that built them. The mysteries of Family Guy's seasons are still open. They will probably stay open. The show will continue, and its later seasons will probably not return to the careful world building of the early years, and the questions we have examined tonight will remain questions. But they were built, and the building of them is worth knowing about. And spending a night sitting with them, unhurried, in the quiet, feels like the right way to honor what was given to them, That is what tonight has been. That is what this will always have been. Sleep well. The sound of the show, music, voice, and what the early episodes understood about atmosphere. There is a dimension of Family Guy's world that written analysis tends to underserve, which is the auditory texture of the show. The specific quality of how it sounds, what the music does in the scenes where it appears, what the voice performances contribute beyond simply delivering the dialogue. These elements are part of the world the show built, and part of why the early seasons feel different from the later ones in ways that go beyond the writing quality alone. Seth MacFarlane is a trained singer and a serious enthusiast of the American songbook, the mid-century popular music tradition that ran from the swing era through the early rock and roll period, and that encompasses the work of composers like Harold Arlen, Johnny Mercer, Sammy Cahn, and Jimmy Van Heusen, among many others. This enthusiasm infuses Family Guy in ways that are visible on the surface. The show has always incorporated musical numbers, parody songs, and references to this musical tradition, but also in ways that operate underneath the surface, in the specific emotional tone that certain scenes carry when they are scored or underscored by music from this tradition. The theme song itself establishes the register immediately. It is a Broadway-style number, expansive and cheerful, carrying the specific warmth of mid-century American popular entertainment in its arrangement and its tempo and the quality of the voices that deliver it. It announces that the show exists in a world that has a specific relationship with American popular culture, not just referencing it, not just parodying it, but actually inhabiting it, using its emotional vocabulary as a genuine resource rather than simply as a target. The original theme arrangement was replaced in the revival seasons with a slightly different version, and the difference, while subtle, is audible to anyone who has spent time with both. The original had a particular looseness to it, a slightly rough quality that matched the animation of the original seasons. The revival version is cleaner and more polished in ways that mirror the change in the animation style, technically improved, but slightly less alive, technically better, but slightly less warm. Music appears throughout the series in various forms. The characters occasionally break into musical numbers, some of them original compositions, and some of them parodies of existing songs. The original compositions are often where the show's real musical talent is most visible. Songs like the Brian's Song parody, or the various holiday numbers that appeared across the seasons, or the original material that Seth MacFarlane and the show's composers created specifically for certain episodes. These songs often carry genuine emotional content that the surrounding episode is not always able to match, and in certain cases they are the best thing in the episode that contains them. The voice cast is part of the show's atmospheric texture in ways that extend beyond performance quality. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 of the show's central characters, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, and the specific quality of his voicing of each of them contributes to the show's sound in a fundamental way. Peter's voice is based on a real person MacFarlane encountered in his life, a security guard at his school, in one account, and the specific quality of that voice, the Rhode Island accent, and the particular energy of it, is part of what makes Peter specific rather than generic. Brian's voice is closer to MacFarlane's natural speaking voice, with adjustments for a specific kind of studied sophistication. Stewie's voice, with its specific British intonation and its theatrical quality, was partly inspired by Rex Harrison, according to MacFarlane's own accounts. Quagmire's voice is a period artifact. It draws on a specific mid-century American masculine style that connects the character to a particular era and a particular set of cultural associations. Alex Borstein's voice for Lois is one of the show's most specific auditory contributions. The Long Island accent that Lois carries, which Borstein has sustained across the entire run of the series, is a specific regional choice that grounds the character in a real demographic reality. A working-class New England woman of a particular type who speaks in a particular way that is immediately recognizable to anyone who has spent time in that part of the world. The voice is as much a characterization choice as any of the dialogue or the story work. The supporting cast voices contribute to the world's texture in ways that accumulate across the show's long run. Mike Henry's voice for Herbert is one of the show's most carefully constructed vocal performances. The specific quality of the whisper, the gentle cadence, the way it conveys both harmlessness and unsettledness simultaneously, is a performance that works on multiple registers at once. The voice is what makes Herbert feel like a real presence rather than simply a shocking premise. The sound design choices across the show's different production eras are also part of the atmosphere, though they are less discussed than the writing or the voice performances. The specific way that sound effects are used, the quality of the ambient sound in different locations, the way that silence is employed in the moments when the show wants something to land with particular weight, these are craft choices that contribute to the emotional texture of the world in ways that are hard to isolate in description, but that are felt in experience. The Vault episode, Brian and Stewie, is a masterclass in the show's use of audio atmosphere. The confined space of the vault has a specific acoustic quality that the episode uses deliberately. Sound bounces differently in a sealed metal room. Voices carry differently. The silence between lines of dialogue feels different. All of this contributes to the claustrophobic intimacy of the episode in ways that pure performance and writing alone could not achieve. The episode sounds like two people trapped in a small space, and that sound is part of what makes the emotional content land. The show's relationship with silence is something that changed across its run in a way that mirrors the changes in its approach to storytelling. The early seasons were comfortable with silence. They allowed moments to breathe. They did not rush to fill every second with a joke or a cutaway or a musical sting. The later seasons became increasingly uncomfortable with silence, filled every available space with content, pushed toward the next joke before the current one had fully settled, avoided the kind of sustained quiet that is necessary for certain kinds of emotional weight to accumulate. This discomfort with silence is connected to the broader shift in how the show was being produced and consumed. A show being watched in clip form, on a phone or a laptop, being shared across social media does not have a relationship with silence the way a show being watched as a sustained experience does. Silence does not clip well. Silence does not share well. Silence requires the audience to be present and patient in ways that certain modern viewing contexts do not support. The early show was made for a different kind of attention. It assumed an audience that would be in the same place for 22 minutes, watching the whole thing from beginning to end, not scrolling away when the pace slowed. This assumed audience could be given silence. They could be given the quiet moments in the Brian and Lois scenes, or the pauses in Peter and Brian's conversations at the bar, or the specific atmospheric stillness of certain late-night scenes in the Griffin house where the children were asleep, and the adults were just present with each other in the way that parents are present with each other when the obligation of performance has temporarily lifted. These quiet moments are part of the texture of the early show's world. They are part of why that world felt real rather than simply entertaining. They gave the characters space to be something other than funny, which paradoxically made the funny moments funnier, because funny moments are funnier when they happen in a world where not everything is funny all the time. The sound of Family Guy at its best is part of its lore in the same way that the character details and the dropped threads are part of its lore. It is evidence that the people making it were thinking about more than the next joke. We're building a world with real atmospheric texture rather than simply producing content in the shape of an animated comedy. The sound of the show is the sound of people caring about what they were making. And the way that sound changed across the show's run is another dimension of the story of what happened to it. The recurring jokes that became their own kind of lore. Family Guy has always been a show that returns to the same wells. The recurring gags, the repeated scenarios, the callbacks, and the established patterns that the audience recognizes and that generate a specific kind of pleasure through recognition. These recurring elements are a feature of the show's comedic identity, and the best of them accumulate into something that functions as its own kind of lore. The giant chicken fights are the most obvious example. Ernie the Giant Chicken first appeared in the episode Da Boom in Season 2, when he gave Peter an expired coupon and Peter attacked him. The subsequent fight, which takes both characters through an increasingly elaborate sequence of locations and confrontations before ending without resolution, was a comedic set piece that worked on pure energy and escalation. The subsequent chicken fights across the show's run, each one returning to the same basic premise and escalating it to new levels of scale and absurdity, became one of the show's most reliable recurring pleasures, the kind of sequence that viewers who know the show anticipate with genuine excitement when they see the chicken appear. What is interesting about the chicken fights as a piece of accumulated lore is that they contain within them a genuine, unresolved question that the comedy never explicitly addresses. Why does Peter keep accepting the encounters? He has been in 5 or 6 of these fights across the show's run, each one nearly fatal, each one resulting in massive collateral damage. Each one ending with Peter and the chickens somehow still alive and still apparently capable of resuming their conflict. The fights should have, by any rational calculus, produced a clear outcome long before they accumulated into a running gag. The specific irrationality of their continuation, the fact that neither party has concluded from the previous fights that the cost of the conflict exceeds whatever the original coupon dispute was worth, is the joke underneath the joke, the meta-comedy that makes the established gag richer the more times it recurs. The Conway Twitty gag, which appeared multiple times in the show's middle and later seasons, is a different kind of recurring element, one that generated controversy precisely because it committed so fully to its own absurdity. Instead of a cutaway joke in the traditional sense, the show would cut to a full performance of Conway Twitty singing one of his songs, unedited, lasting for an extended period of time while the audience simply watched. The gag was the anti-joke, the moment where the show declined to do the expected thing and instead filled the space with something that was emphatically not the expected thing. The first time it happened, it was surprising enough to work. By the third or fourth time, it was the most visible symbol of creative exhaustion that the show ever produced. But there is something interesting even in this about the relationship between the recurring gag and the audience's expectations. The Conway Twitty bit worked, initially, because the audience expected something and received something entirely different. The subsequent repetitions worked for a subset of the audience because the repetition itself became the joke. The audacity of continuing to deploy the same non-joke across multiple episodes as if it were still the surprising thing it had been the first time. Whether this is comedy or simply stubbornness is a question the show never fully resolved, and the unresolved quality of that question is itself a minor mystery in the show's history. The recurring appearances of James Woods, the actor, throughout the show's early and middle seasons created their own mythology. James Woods first appeared in the season 4-episode Peter's Got Woods, and the character who bears his name and his face became a recurring presence across multiple seasons before his eventual death in a later episode. The James Woods character was one of the show's most successful deployments of a real celebrity as a fictionalized version of themselves, given a specific and consistent characterization that was clearly not intended as a genuine portrait of the real person, but that functioned as a genuine recurring character within the show's world. His death in the later seasons closed a storyline that had been running across multiple seasons with more narrative continuity than the show usually maintained. The relationship between certain locations and their recurring appearances also constitutes a form of lore. The Drunken Clam has been a consistent setting across the show's entire run, and its specific visual design and its regular patrons have accumulated into a place that carries the weight of all the scenes that have happened there. Peter and his friends have had hundreds of conversations at that bar across the show's run, and the accumulated history of those conversations, even when most of them are not specifically remembered or referenced, contributes to the atmosphere of the place in a way that new locations introduced in individual episodes cannot match. The Griffin household itself is the most intensively inhabited, recurring location in the show's world, and its specific design has become so familiar to long-term viewers that even small changes register as notable. The layout of the house, the living room arrangement, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms, the staircase down which Peter has fallen in many different ways across many different episodes, is a kind of visual lore in itself, accumulated through repetition into a place that feels as familiar as an actual house that one has spent time in. All of this accumulated familiarity, with the locations, the recurring gags, the specific quality of the returning characters, is part of what makes the show's world feel real in a way that individual episodes alone cannot produce. The world of Quahog is not built by any single episode. It is built by the accumulated experience of watching many episodes, absorbing the repeated elements, building a mental map of the place and the people and the patterns. The lore is not in any individual story. It is in the total picture that the stories, taken together, produce. This is true of the mysteries, too. The mystery of Brian's novel is not built in any single episode. It is built by the accumulated picture of a character who has been referring to an unfinished novel across hundreds of episodes, each reference adding a small amount to the total weight of the mystery. The mystery of Meg's parentage is not built in the one courtroom scene where Stan Thompson is named. It is built by everything the show established about Meg before that scene and everything it has implied since, taken together. The lore is cumulative. The mysteries are cumulative. And understanding them requires the kind of long attention that a show of this duration rewards in ways that shorter works cannot. The specific reward of having watched long enough and carefully enough that the accumulated weight of small details becomes something larger than any of those details individually. This is why tonight has been what it has been. Not to extract a secret meaning from a comedy show that was not trying to have one, but to acknowledge what was built across a long run of careful and sometimes careless storytelling, and to give that building the kind of attention that building deserves. The world of Quahog, Rhode Island, is a fictional place, but it is a fictional place with real weight, accumulated across real time, by real people who cared enough, in the moments that mattered, to build it well. The mysteries stay open, the weight stays real, and the people of Spooner Street are still there, carrying what they carry, which is everything the show gave them, which is more than most shows bother to give. Sleep well. Everything the show got right that nobody talks about Family Guy's reputation has become so dominated by the conversation about its decline, about what it lost across 20-plus seasons, about the characters who deteriorated and the humor that curdled and the warmth that drained away, that it is worth spending some time before we close on what the show consistently got right throughout its run, even in the seasons when the headline story was things going wrong. The voice performances never declined. This is worth saying plainly. Seth MacFarlane, Alex Borstein, Mila Kunis, Seth Green, and Mike Henry have all maintained their characterizations across the full run of the show at a level of craft and consistency that deserves more acknowledgement than it receives. Voice acting is often undervalued as a form, treated as less serious than on-camera performance in ways that do not reflect the genuine skill involved. The consistency of the Family Guy cast across more than 20 years, showing up to the recording booth and finding the specific qualities of these characters reliably, in episode after episode, in some cases across significant changes in how those characters were written, is a genuine achievement. Mila Kunis's performance as Meg in particular deserves specific recognition. She was given, in the middle and later seasons, material that was difficult to do anything meaningful with. Dialogue and scenarios that asked her to be purely a target without any of the character texture that the early seasons had provided. She managed to maintain Meg's essential humanity even in those contexts, to find something real in the character, even when the writing was not providing anything to work from. The occasional episodes where Meg was given more to do, where the writing tried harder, benefited from the foundation Kunis had maintained across the episodes where the writing had tried less. The character was intact when the writers decided to care about her, partly because the performer had kept her intact across the years when the writers had not. The musical episodes and musical sequences were consistently among the show's most genuinely accomplished work across its entire run. When the show committed to a full musical number, original music, full performance, real effort put into the construction of the song, and its integration with the scene, the results were often excellent. The musical talent in the cast and in the production team is real, and the musical sequences are where that talent most reliably showed up in the final product regardless of what era of the show they were produced in. The road trip episodes, the Road to Baisai series, featuring Brian and Stewie on various adventures together, maintained quality across many seasons better than most of the show's other recurring formats. The specific dynamic between Brian and Stewie worked reliably in these episodes, in ways that it sometimes did not in the show's regular domestic settings, partly because the road trip format gave both characters license to be at their best, Brian's dry observation and Stewie's manic intelligence, without the interference of the broader ensemble or the domestic comedy requirements. The Road to the Multiverse episode in Season 8 is widely considered one of the show's best, and its quality holds up as evidence that the show retained the capacity for excellent creative work well into its later years. The holiday episodes, particularly the Christmas episodes, were often where the show put its warmest material. Christmas Guy, the episode where Stewie saves Brian from death using time travel, is one of the most emotionally effective episodes the show produced in any era. It works because it deploys the genuine warmth of the Brian and Stewie relationship, built across many seasons of The Road to episodes and the Vault episode and various other contexts, in a scenario where the stakes are real and the emotion is earned. The episode lands because the show had done the work to make the relationship feel real, and the emotional payoff of the Christmas rescue sequence is proportional to that investment. The show's willingness to commit to dramatic premises when it had established sufficient character groundwork was one of its reliable strengths even in the middle and later seasons. When the writing staff decided an episode deserved to be taken seriously, when they decided a character deserved a real story rather than a scenario for jokes, the results were often as good as anything the show had produced in its best years. The problem was not that the capability had disappeared. The problem was the uneven distribution of when the capability was deployed. The show's music licensing and its use of real popular music throughout its run was another consistent asset. The specific choices of music in individual scenes, the songs used to score emotional moments, to undercut dramatic ones, to create the particular mood of ironic distance that the show often deployed, reflected genuine musical knowledge and genuine care about the relationship between sound and image. The show used real music as a creative resource rather than simply as background, and the results were consistently better than the approach of generic scored music that most animated comedies employed. The animation, while it changed across the show's different production eras in ways that the most devoted fans could track, maintained a baseline quality throughout that was sufficient to the show's storytelling needs. The character designs, established in the original seasons, were durable enough to sustain 20-plus years of production without feeling outdated in ways that undermined the comedy. The background art in Quahog developed a specific visual identity across the show's run that contributed to the sense of the town as a real place, consistent enough to feel inhabited without being so rigid that it could not accommodate the wide range of tonal registers that the show required. The show's relationship with its own history, its willingness to reference its own past, to call back to earlier episodes, to acknowledge the accumulated weight of its own run, was something that improved across the seasons rather than declining. The early seasons had relatively little self-referential content, being too new to have accumulated much to reference. The middle and later seasons developed an increasingly rich vocabulary of callbacks and references to established lore that rewarded long-term viewers. When this was done well, when a callback to an earlier episode deepened the current story, rather than simply signaling that the writers remembered something, it was one of the show's most satisfying qualities. All of these positive elements coexisted with the problems that the show's critics have correctly identified. Both things are true simultaneously. The show declined in specific ways across its run and maintained strengths in other ways across the same period. The character work got less careful while the voice performances stayed excellent. The storytelling got thinner while the musical sequences stayed accomplished. The world building became less consistent while the world that had been built retained its accumulated weight. This is the full picture of what Family Guy is, viewed from the specific vantage point of tonight. After spending many hours with its mysteries, its dropped threads, its carefully built lore, its inconsistencies, its genuine achievements, it is a show that built something real in its early years, that held on to some of what it built while letting go of other parts, that continued for far longer than its original vision could sustain, and that in its longevity accumulated a world that is richer and stranger and more historically weighted than its reputation fully acknowledges. The mysteries of its seasons are the evidence of the richness. They were planted by people who cared about the world they were building, and they are worth caring about in return, even if the show itself eventually stopped giving them the attention they deserved. That is the last thing to say. The world was built. The mysteries are real. The evidence of caring is there and caring about it in return. Spending time with it, thinking about it seriously, sitting with the questions it raised and did not answer, is the appropriate response to work that was made with that kind of intention. Everything else the town contains, all the lore and the secrets and the histories and the questions, belongs to anyone willing to spend the time to look for it. The mysteries stay open. The town keeps its secrets. The lights are on in the house on Spooner Street. Sleep well. A note on how to watch old episodes. Before we truly close, there is one practical thing worth saying to anyone who has spent tonight here and finds themselves wanting to return to the show with fresh eyes after thinking about all of this. The way to watch the early seasons of Family Guy now, having spent time with the questions raised tonight, is slowly. Not in the background noise way that animated comedies often get watched, where they are on the television while other things are happening and you absorb the jokes without fully attending to what the show is doing between and underneath them, actively, with the sound up and the phone down and the willingness to pause when something is interesting. Watch for the moments when a character is given more space than the joke required. Watch for the background details in the scenes at the Drunken Clam and the Griffin dinner table in the school hallways. Watch for the moments when Lois says something that reveals she is a person with an interior life the show is only partially depicting. Watch for the moments when Brian says something that is not funny but is true. Watch for the way Peter's face looks when the show lets him feel something, rather than simply react to something. Watch for Stewie in the first season, before the softening began, and try to see the original character from the outside rather than through the filter of everything the later seasons overlaid on him. Watch Mr. Weed's scenes in the first 2 seasons with the knowledge of what the show built around him, and what his will ultimately said about what he valued. Watch the scene in Screwed the Pooch where Brian names Stan Thompson, and notice the way Meg is wearing headphones, and think about what that staging is doing. Watch the Vault episode, Brian and Stewie, and let it be what it actually is, which is the most emotionally honest 30 minutes the show ever produced, and which works as well as it does because the show had built genuine depth in both characters across many previous seasons. These things are there, they were built. They have been sitting in the episodes waiting for the kind of attention that brings them into focus. Tonight has been about finding them and naming them, but finding and naming is only the beginning of knowing. Knowing them requires the experience of seeing them in the episodes themselves, embedded in the specific texture of what the show was doing at the time it made them. The early Family Guy is worth rewatching with this level of attention. Not because it is perfect. It is not perfect, and even its best episodes have their failures and their limitations, and their moments of lazy comedy in the middle of genuinely interesting stories. But because the world it built is real enough to reward the attention, and the characters it created in those seasons are specific enough to be worth knowing properly. The mysteries are the invitation to look more carefully. That has been the argument of this entire night. The mysteries are the show saying, there is more here than the surface. Look closer, the surface is funny, and the funny is real, and the funny matters. But there is more than the surface if you want it. You can want it. The invitation is open. The last word, what stays with you? It has been a long night. We have covered a lot of ground. The Season 1 mystery of Jonathan Weed and his demolished factory and his terminal disease institute. The Season 2 mystery of what Brian knew about Meg and what the family has been keeping from her across 20 years. The Season 3 mystery of the novel that stays blank because finishing it would require looking at something too clearly. The Season 4 mystery of the evil genius who was retired before his story was complete. The Season 5 mystery of the mayor and the private logic that nobody can access. The Season 6 mystery of the simulation machine and what it means for everything that came after. The Season 7 mystery of who Quagmire actually is underneath the persona the show has been running. The Season 8 mystery of what Brian kept in the bank. The Season 9 mystery of what the bestseller revealed about the man who wrote it. The Season 10 mystery of the hurricane and the mechanism it exposed inside the family. The Season 11 and 12 mystery of the death that was always going to be undone. And the large, ongoing mystery of the town itself, its history, its people, its specific gravity, the way it holds everyone inside it. All of those mysteries are still open. None of them are solved. None of them will be solved, probably, because the show is not in the business of solving them, and because the questions are genuinely more interesting than any answer the show would have provided. What stays with you from a night like this is not the specific answers to specific questions. It is the quality of attention that the questions invite. The awareness that the surface of a long-running show is not the whole story. The understanding that the people who made it, at their best, were thinking about more than the joke in front of them, and building more than what any individual episode required. The sense of a world that was genuinely built, with care and with intention, and with the specific love that people bring to things they are making because they want the things to be real. Family Guy built something real in its early seasons and held on to pieces of it across its long run. The mysteries of those seasons are the evidence of the building. They are the footprints of the people who cared enough to leave them. That is what stays. That is what makes the walk worth taking. Thank you for being here tonight. Drop a comment when you wake up and tell me which mystery stayed with you the longest. And subscribe if this is the kind of time you want to spend here. Slow, thorough, unhurried, finding the real things in the places where real things were built. Sleep well. A final walk down Spooner Street. Let us do one last thing before we close. Let us walk down Spooner Street one more time, slowly, in the particular quiet of late night in a fictional neighborhood in a fictional Rhode Island city that has been someone's home for over 2 decades of storytelling. The Swanson house on the left. Joe's police cruiser in the driveway, modified for his use. Bonnie's car beside it. The lights in the living room still on because somebody always stays up a little later than they intend to. Inside that house are people who have been through what families go through. The difficulties of a long marriage, the specific challenges of a disability in a culture not built for it, the distance that grows between people who love each other when the daily requirements of their shared life do not leave room for the things that keep love feeling current. They are still there. They are still Swansons on Spooner Street. The gravity held them. The Griffin house in the middle. Living room light on, television probably. Peter's specific footprint in the couch. Lois somewhere in the house doing the thing that needs doing because there is always something that needs doing. Meg in her room, possibly, with music playing. She has always had music playing, which is her way of maintaining a private interior space in a household that does not respect the privacy of interior spaces. Chris somewhere, probably content, probably not thinking about anything that requires resolution. Stewie in his crib, which is the wrong word for what Stewie occupies at night, but it is the word the show uses. Brian on his dog bed, or on the couch, which is where he actually sleeps. The house in the middle of the street, full of its people, lit from inside, audible from the street on a quiet night, in the way that houses with families in them are always audible from the street if you slow down enough to listen. The Quagmire house on the right, quieter than the Griffin house usually. The lights arranged in the specific pattern of a man who lives alone and has arranged his space for his own purposes. Inside that house is a person who watches, who files what he sees, who did the loving thing with his daughter even when it cost him something, who has been on Spooner Street for the whole run of the show and shows no signs of leaving. The gravity holds him too. Down the street, Herbert's house, the lights on or off depending on the time. Jesse the dog inside with him, old and slow and perfectly matched to the man he lives with. Inside that house are 70 years of history that the show built and left in the unlit rooms, and those rooms are not empty even if the camera never enters them. They are full of the specific weight of a specific American life across a specific American century, and the man who lived that life is still there, and he has made it through, and the house is still standing on the street that holds all of them. Further down, the rest of the neighborhood, the rest of the city, the rest of Quahog with its specific history from the colonial period forward, its specific economic geography, its specific relationship to the larger New England world that contains it. The news station where Tom Tucker comes to work. The high school where Meg goes and is not valued and keeps going back to anyway. The brewery where Peter earns the money that keeps the house on Spooner Street operational. The diner, the shops, the various institutions of a small American city that has been in slow transition for a generation. The lake that was contaminated and then, for one episode, briefly not contaminated, and then presumably contaminated again. The Drunken Clam, amber lit from inside, where the same group of men have been showing up in the same seats for the entire run of the show. This is the world. All of it together, the large picture and the small details, the primary mysteries and the secondary lore and the accumulated texture of 20-plus years of storytelling that built a place that feels genuinely inhabited. It is a fictional world, but it was made with enough care in enough moments across enough episodes that it has the weight of something real. The weight of a place where people actually live and carry things and stay longer than they plan to, because the gravity of shared history is the kind of force that holds people the way the earth holds everything on its surface. not through any single powerful grip, but through the sustained, quiet, omnipresent pressure of mass and time. The mysteries are in that world. They have been there since the first season built them in. They will stay there as long as the episodes exist and as long as anyone cares to find them. That is what tonight has been. Finding them, naming them, sitting with them long enough to feel their weight, and then releasing them back into the world they came from, where they will remain open and patient and real, waiting for the next person who slows down enough to notice them. Thank you for being here for all of it. Sleep well. Really. Sleep well.